this. All right, so you
Okay,
guys can take it away.
so the format of this is that I'm going to read some comments that I actually wrote at the last minute, pre-prepared remarks. I've sent them to James. He knows what I'm going to say. Um, but I spoke to James this morning, and he asked me for one favor. He said he wanted to make sure that everyone knew what Bastille Day was. So I suspect that if you don't know what Bastille Day is, you won't get much from this conversation anyway. But I'm happy to oblige, and it's an interesting thing. So let me explain Bastille Day. The Bastille was a fortress uh, in Paris, at the edge of Paris originally. It was built in the 14th century to protect Paris from basically the English armies during the Hundred Years' War. Later on, it served as a prison for the absolutist regime, and it became a symbol of despotism. It was torn down by a mob, probably not just spontaneous, but it was torn down by a mob. It was attacked, and the prisoners were liberated on July 14, 1789. And this has become a symbol of the French Revolution. Um, it had already become a symbol of despotism beforehand, and the most famous resident of the Bastille was the famous Marquis de Sade, who actually was released only 10 days before the fall of the Bastille. And he was released because he improvised the megaphone and shouted out to people on the street, "The warders are killing the prisoners." And he was sent off to an insane asylum, and then he spent some time there, and then he got out and spent some time in politics, and yada yada. Um, there were a lot of feeling. So there was already a feeling, actually, that the Bastille should be torn down. The lieutenant of police, about a year before it was torn down, had said that it had no military purpose, it was a waste of money, and that it could only be used against the nearby residents of Paris, and that it was therefore a bad symbol for the government. Um, Sébastien Mercier, who wrote this utopian novel set in the far future in the 1770s, of course, imagines a Paris without the Bastille when there's an enlightened mind. So, so the Bastille and Bastille Day became a symbol of the French Revolution, although the actual attack on the Bastille was not really that politically important. And it was to some extent an empty symbol. I mean, it really was not the cruel dungeon that it appeared. Many of the descriptions make it sound more like a hotel. When the prison was taken over by the mob, there were four people who were there for counterfeiting, two who were declared mentally insane, and one aristocrat who was there because his family wanted him there, which you could do under the Ancien regime. Um, as a symbol of the French Revolution, it was early, the anniversary was early celebrated under the First Republic. Then, under the various monarchist restorations, it was repressed. Um, and then finally, under the Third Republic, and I'm mentioning his history because I think it's a nice microcosm of the story of the Revolution and France. Uh, Finally, in 1880, was declared the French National Day, which it is to this day. It's the French equivalent of the 4th of July. And the only exception to that, of course, was under Vichy, where it was declared a national day of mourning and commemoration and pensiveness, because Vichy did not accept the legacy of the French Revolution as this quasi-fascist regime. Um, okay, having mentioned that little history, and assuming you probably knew about what Bastille Day was to begin with, as I said, I prepared some remarks, and I will read them. They're a bit longer than I would have wanted because I didn't have time to make them short. And they were also written at the last minute. I think they're a bit of, as Henry James said about Tolstoy's novels, a baggy monster, but here goes. The idea for this talk, I hope that everyone can hear me. Can everyone hear me? Hello? Can everyone hear me? Okay. The idea for this talk was formulated in a bar in Manhattan on the 4th of July this year, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The American and French revolutions are siblings, or since revolutions like ships seem to attract the feminine gender, we might say they are sisters. Indeed, this gendered and familial formulation of sister revolutions and sister republics goes back to the 1790s. Like all responsible parents, Platypus will deny that we play favorites, yet there are favorites. It is not that the less favored child is unloved, of course, but rather that the more favored child is loved more, or perhaps simply more easily loved. It has been clear to me for a long time that it is the elder American sister which is favored in Platypus, and while the younger sister may receive an occasional compliment, she is clearly considered somewhat of a problem child. My intent here, though, is not to cast aspersions on the elder sister, but rather by way of compensation to put the spotlight on the neglected younger sister. Some years ago, I rashly proposed a series of lectures on the French Revolution, which because of my laziness, depression, and perfectionism have so far come to nothing. In the process, I have found myself, however, reading quite a bit about the subject, and the more I have studied and thought about it, the more I realize how deep a subject it is, and one that intrigues me precisely because it perplexes me. Some time ago, a friend in Platypus remarked that if she went to Chris with a question, that he responded with an answer that felt clarifying. But if she came to me, that I usually responded with an answer that left her more confused than before. Perversely, I felt pleased with this response. If I cannot clarify things to myself, I can at least try to be deeply confused instead of shallowly confused. It may be bad pedagogy, but I hope also that I can share some of my deep confusion with you. James is, of course, an expert on the American Revolution, and our reading group this summer has been deliberately conceived as a defense of the American Revolution. That defense, in the peculiar circumstances of time, is essentially against a wokeism that sees 1776 as a slaveholders' revolt. Even 50 years ago, such a defense of 1776 against the left would not have been necessary. In a way that would shock many people now, the New Left celebrated the Bastille as proof that America had revolutionary heritage that needed to be revived and continued. In some need to defend the American Revolution as fighting the American Revolution in Platypus, because there is a suspicion that any contrasting of the two is an attack on the American Revolution. I understand this anxiety, but nevertheless feel the need to push back against it. The two sisters, for all their family resemblances, were different, and the differences are as interesting to me as the similarities, and they do not always reflect badly on the younger sister. One might imagine that I am here to defend the French Revolution. I am not. As I say it, I imagine a banner headline in Workers' Vanguard: "Defend the French Revolution." But this defense, quote unquote, like the defense, quote unquote, of the North Korean deformed worker state, or the Palestinian people, or the Soviet Union, is less about the object defended, quote unquote, and more a matter of self-orientation in the midst of a confusing and dispiriting history. James writes, "The fascination of the revolution had been that it seemed to prefigure both the utopic possibilities of the modern and its realities. It was an urgent problem to understand why Jacobin of 1792, filled with public spirit, the declarations of the rights of man in his hand, and the love of humanity in his heart, should have become the terrorist of 1794. Was there a fundamental incoherence in the set of formal rights and liberties through which the revolutionaries sought to act? Was there an incompatibility between the ideas of liberty and equality inscribed in revolutionary legislation and political structures and the class nature of modern society? Both the failures of the left and the survival of capitalism show that these problems, the utopian possibilities and the brutalities, are still with us." Can someone confirm that I'm hearable?
You're hearable. Your video's shimmering a little bit, but the audio is pretty persistent. I feel like If you
I,
want to, you could turn off your video stream, and I think it would, like, all of the jitters would probably stop, but right now it seems like it's fine.
okay, okay, as long as you can hear. The French Revolution is a no. The old idea that 79 marked the beginning of political modernity was not wrong. When Hobsbawm wrote his Age Revolution, he chose the date 1789 to 1848. He could have chosen 1776 to 1848. He didn't. Both Hegel and Marx returned to the French Revolution as a key to modernity. There is no animus towards the American Revolution, no 1619 nonsense. Little attention is paid to it compared to the French Revolution. It was, to Marxists, the original model of bourgeois revolution. Should you see this then as a conversation between the American and French revolutions, with James representing the former and I the latter? Yes and no. It is about the two sisters, but there is a third revolution which completes the family triangle, the Bolshevik Revolution. Had the Bolshevik Revolution never occurred, we would talk about the American and French revolutions entirely differently. One should not dismiss periodization. It is often a key to ideas. When, for example, did the French Revolution begin and end? The beginning is not too difficult. Certainly by the fall of the Bastille, the revolution had already begun. And in terms of political significance, the tennis court oath was of greater importance than the fall of the Bastille. Perhaps one could date the revolution then from June 1789, or the opening of the Estates General on May 5th, or could go back a bit further to August 8, 1788, when they were called, or perhaps even to the Council of Notables on February 22nd, 1787. But none of these dates really matter. If one goes back 1,000 days before July 14, 1789, the Ancien regime was intact and no one expected its imminent collapse. If one goes forward 1,000 days from the fall of the Bastille, however, the Ancien regime was obviously gone. The rapidity and unpredictability of these events is striking. But while one might argue about the exact date of the beginning of the French Revolution, the far more striking question is, when does it end? François Furet famously declared, La Révolution française est terminée. The French Revolution is over. But he said that in 1978. So when did it end? Did it end in Thermidor? Did it end with the 18th Brumaire? Did it end in 1804 or 1850 or 1830 or 1848? Or is the Commune in 1871 its last gasp? If one is to see it in purely French terms, perhaps a date between 1873 and 1877, when the Third Republic, which could be seen as both the fulfillment and negation of the Jacobins, was consolidated, would be appropriate. Today is not only the 237th anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, it is also the 137th anniversary of the founding of the Second International, which was deliberately founded in Paris on the centenary of the fall of the Bastille. Chris, at the 2012 Platypus Convention, gave a talk on the century of Marxism, 1873 to 1973. One might also speak of the century of the French Revolution, 1789 to 1889. I would like to pose the question then of what is the relationship between the opening date and the closing date. One could certainly choose many. So here I'm arguing in a platypus left-centric way that the revolution ended on July 14th, 1889, with the formation of the Second International. The essential assumption of the Second International about the French Revolution was that it was both the successor to the French Revolution and that it also had rendered it obsolete. The future revolution would not be like it, and yet all honor to its great and necessary predecessor. The French Revolution was bourgeois, and the future revolution would be socialist. What was most admirable about the French Revolution was that it pushed the bourgeois revolution to its limits. The Jacobins were the bourgeoisie, so unlike the bourgeoisie in 1848, at its most heroic. Trotsky described Jacobinism as the highest degree of radicalism that bourgeois society can provide. But if it had repugnant aspects, the terror, these were to be understood as limitations imposed by its bourgeois character. The socialist revolution would not need terror. This is a good story, if only the truth were so simple. Unfortunately, the Second International did not result in socialism, but died only 25 years later. By a strange fate, it died on August 4th, 1914, when the German SPD voted for war credits exactly 125 years after the convention had abolished feudal privileges in France in 1789. How ironic the juxtaposition of these two August 4ths. If the Second International had believed that it had overcome Jacobinism, however, the Third International embraced it. Indeed, both positively and negatively, one cannot help but be struck by how much the Bolsheviks were haunted by the French Revolution and sought analogies with it. Carefully, pedagogy. Do we not already know what to think about Jacobinism? The official Platypus line expressed on his liberty of the ancients compared to the moderns that we read every year in the reading group. Was not Jacobinism anachronism, a mistaken understanding of modernity? Would the Bolsheviks, whose political conception we hold up as the most adequate to its time, be entranced by a long refuted and overcome error? Why does it seem in the 20th century then that the proletarian revolution repeats the bourgeois revolution of the 18th? In fact, not merely the bourgeois revolution, but a specific bourgeois revolution, the French Revolution. For of the two sisters, it is by far the younger one that the classical Marxists refer to and think about. Why? Did they not think that the American Revolution was equally important? As I said, certainly there was no 1690 nonsense. Is this a matter of cultural provincialism? That as Europeans, they knew it better. America's far away. Was it their Eurocentrism? I don't think so. I would propose something different. Platypus has a formula that capitalism is the crisis of bourgeois society. I would say that the left is the crisis of the bourgeois revolution. Intuitively, I think that it was a recognition of the critical character, critical in the sense of being a crisis, of the French Revolution at its most radical, that haunted what I am calling the century of the French Revolution. I'm just checking. Can I still be heard clearly?
You're kind of jittering a little bit, but it's it's all right.
Okay, I'll maybe turn off the. One can speak of a quadrilateral of dates: 1789, 1793, 1889. Can I be heard? I'm sorry to keep. Is it better without the video?
It may be
One
better
can
if I,
speak of
it
a
may be better if I
quadrilateral
video.
of dates without the video. Okay, I'm sorry about this. One can speak of a quadrilateral of dates: 1789, 1793, 1889, and 1917. 1789 is the bourgeois revolution in its purity. 1793 is the bourgeois revolution in crisis. 1889 is the socialist revolution in its purity, the true heir of both 1789 and 1793, but an overcoming of both. And 1917 is not 1917 once again a crisis? This time,
Oh no, we lost him.
am I back? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back. Richard, are you there?
Yeah, okay. Uh,
Yeah, let's all turn everyone except for James. Let's turn off video for now, please. Maybe that will help a little bit. Okay. All right, let's try to do that.
Okay, I'm not sure where I ended, but I was okay. One can speak of a quadrilateral of dates: 1789, 1793, 1889, and 1917. 1789 is the bourgeois revolution in its purity. 1793 is the bourgeois revolution in crisis. 1889 is the socialist revolution in its purity, the true heir of both 1789 and 1793, but an overcoming of both. And 1917 is not 1917 once again a crisis, this time of the socialist revolution? Is not the entirety of the short 20th century a working out of this crisis, a working out that fails by 1989 to 91? But here is what is striking to me. 1917 revives the ghost of 1793. Is this not the real anxiety about the French Revolution? The thought that there is a straight line from the guillotine to the gulag, and that the spirit of 1937 in Soviet Russia is the same as 1793 in France. The revolution consumes the revolutionaries. How different the American Revolution is. The founding fathers do not end up murdering each other. In Platypus, there is certainly a preference among all the founders for Jefferson, but no one can seriously consider Hamilton or Adams counter-revolutionaries. Indeed, despite their political differences, Adams and Jefferson remained friends. But does not the opposition of Bolshevik and Menshevik inevitably suggest that of Jacobin and Girondin? It certainly did to the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. The truth is that, for better or worse, that the American Revolution lacked a Jacobin moment. Except for Jefferson, most of the American founders loathed the Jacobins, and the sympathy when it was expressed, as for example by Jefferson, for the Jacobins, for the French Revolution, was simply a defensive sense that the critics of 1793 were indirectly attacking 1789. That Jefferson's closest friend among the French revolutionaries was Lafayette speaks to me of his distance from Jacobinism. The logic of the development of the two sister revolutions was quite different, however. From a liberal standpoint, it is obvious that the American Revolution is the healthy one and that the French Revolution somehow, quote, went wrong, unquote. But when and how exactly did it go wrong? Shall we endorse the views of Burke or those of the Girondins? Or maybe even go with Babeuf? Perhaps the problem with Jacobinism was not that it went too far, but that it did not go far enough, and realized that the only way to achieve the goals of Jacobinism was to proceed on to a socialist revolution. A great deal depends on an exactitude of dates. I have spoken of 1793 as a problem, but the terror led to Thermidor. The terror is what usually preoccupies liberals, but for revolutionaries, the actual problem might be instead Thermidor. Perhaps 1794 and not 1793 is what needs explaining. Trotsky seems, for example, obsessed with the problem of Thermidor. Is not the fundamental question with Trotsky's analysis of the Soviet Union this problematic equivalence of Stalinism with Thermidor? If the terror is understood fundamentally defensively, then Thermidor, which ends the terror, is the counter-revolution within the revolution. In this respect, the Bolshevik Revolution and the French Revolution are similar. The pure external counter-revolution in both cases fails, but the revolution is also incapable of sustaining itself at its original intensity. The revolution in both cases fails, although it is not militarily overcome. Thus, in the dates 1793, 1794, and the couple Terror-Thermidor, two questions are hidden. Was the terror inevitable? And was Thermidor then inevitable? In the original bourgeois case of the French Revolution, the problem may be treated as historical. Perhaps the Jacobins embraced an impossible task given their historical circumstances. The first time as tragedy. Is this the same as attributing to the Jacobins an ancient concept of liberty? Perhaps yes and no. Perhaps that which Constant diagnosed as an ancient concept of liberty was an unconscious awareness by the Jacobins of their untimeliness in the other direction. Perhaps they needed to imagine themselves as ancient Romans, not because they were behind their own time, but because they were ahead of it and needed social conditions to catch up to their radical democratic policies. What troubles me about simply accepting tout court the Constant analysis of the Jacobins is not that it is, of course, an attack on Jacobinism from the right, which does not bother me, the most left-wing position is not always the correct one, although I sometimes feel a need to explain that in the reading group. The most, but and Constant was obviously a liberal and not a reactionary. But rather that this view of Jacobinism does not explain to me something that Constant could not have known about: the retrospective self-identification of the Bolsheviks with the Jacobins. Was this identification a double mistake, a mistake of the 20th century, identifying itself with the 18th and the 18th with antiquity? The historical analogy is fraught too. Trotsky cannot accept, of course, the necessity of Thermidor. Thermidor is an unfortunate reality, but it must be seen as accidental. It could have been otherwise. If not, Stalinism must be seen as the necessary result of the Bolshevik Revolution. And perhaps now someone might ask if Stalinism was merely a long detour on the way to 1991 and Putin's Russia. So is Trotsky's analogy of Stalinism with Thermidor correct? This is a difficult problem. Although there is a tendency to imagine the Jacobins as proto-socialists, the reality is that they were eminently bourgeois. The Jacobins, except Babeuf, and in this respect he ceased to be a Jacobin, could not imagine a world without private property. They also did not recognize the radical technical transformation that the modern world was about to undergo. Can people still hear me?
Yes.
They lived mentally in the world of Adam Smith, or perhaps even the physiocrats, before the first industrial revolution. But the Bolsheviks lived not only after the first industrial revolution, they, like the rest of the second and third internationals, lived in the world of the second industrial revolution. If the 18th century challenges us with the modernity of its thought, one must constantly remind oneself of its material backwardness. I've often wondered if in many respects the world of Robespierre and Danton was not closer, at least in its physical reality, to those of Saint Louis or the Abbot Suger than to that of de Gaulle or Sartre or Waldeck-Rochet. I jocularly referred to the Babeauvian vision as 18th century Maoism, but could one not also see in it, despite all its radical differences, a parallel vision to Jefferson's vision for America in its combination of Enlightenment rationalism and agrarian utopianism? By contrast, the Russian peasantry was for the Bolsheviks in the 1920s, as Stephen Dedalus would have said, a nightmare from which they were trying to awake. To me, the difference between the two revolutions is symbolized by two images: the Fête de l'Être Suprême on the one hand, and Tatlin's monument to the Third International on the other. Almost finished. This brings me to my final point. The most mysterious thing about the bourgeois revolutions is why they happened at all. Please notice the plural form. One is not asking about the bourgeois revolution singular, which is essentially to make the revolution equivalent to modernity, but rather a series of discrete political events, an American Revolution, a French Revolution, etc., whose anniversaries we celebrate on particular days and whose memories become part of contested national narratives. The old story of the bourgeois revolutions was that they were necessary. A rising class overcame the resistance of feudal society. This is originally a liberal story that then got taken up by Marxists. From the liberal historians of the Restoration to Marxist historians after World War II, the story is basically the same: the bourgeoisie taking class power. The story originated in trying to make sense of the French Revolution. In many respects, rather unfashionably, I think that the old liberal Marxist story is basically true, and that is why its truth convinced people for so long. But one is still left with a question: why did the bourgeoisie really need these revolutions? Have we not seen over and over again how the bourgeoisie, meaning capitalism, can triumph without bourgeois revolutions? Only in a few cases, albeit very important cases, where capitalism triumphed over fetters inherited from pre-capitalist social formations, did bourgeois revolutions occur. If we live in a world of global capitalism, where the centrality of Europe has long ended, and even that of the United States is now challenged, should we not, a la Deepak Chakrabarty provincialized the American and French revolutions. What do the bourgeois revolutions mean to China, for example? Certainly, one can say that the Chinese path to modernity was overwhelmingly conditioned by a world dominated by Europe and America, and that in that respect, the bourgeois revolutions have become part of a universal history of humanity. One might also say that insofar as, for example, dissident Chinese intellectuals criticize their regime, they do so in a language of universal human rights and freedom made possible by the American and French revolutions. But here too a paradox intervenes. When China was fervently Maoist, say during the Cultural Revolution, it was easier to see a kind of unconscious repetition of the terror in the Cultural Revolution. Was Deng Xiaoping then another echo of Thermidor? The language of analogies and influences appears broken here to me. In Capital and History, Chris Cutrone wrote, what would it mean to treat the entire Marxian project as first and foremost a recognition of the history of modernity, tout court, as one of the pathology of transition from the class society that emerged with the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago and the civilizations based on an essentially peasant way of life? Although through the emergence of the commodity form of social mediation to the present global civilization dominated by capital, towards a form of humanity that might lie beyond this. The question I now pose is what role do the classic bourgeois revolutions play in this transformation? Consider, for example, the following quote from Richard Feynman. From a long view of the history of mankind, seen, say, 10,000 years from now, there can be little doubt that the most significant event of the 19th century will be judged as Maxwell's discovery of the laws of electrodynamics. The American Civil War will pale into provincial insignificance in comparison with this important scientific event of the same decade. It is easy to dismiss this as simply Feynman's scientific philistinism. But is this not the common sense of our time? This is the paradox of the bourgeois revolutions. For as long as modernity could be seen as pointing to socialism, the bourgeois revolutions could be also seen as pointing towards socialism. With the decline of socialism, liberalism consumes itself and historical memory becomes brittle and crumbles. Modernity then indeed comes to seem a purely technical matter. Capitalism becomes seen as simply a nursery for technological innovation and ideas. Of human freedom beyond capitalism seem impossible. Is this not the meaning of the cult of Elon Musk, or the deep pessimism of most science fiction today? I think that this is part of the reason why our section on bourgeois radical philosophy is so appealing and enlightening to many of the young people who encounter it. It explains modernity as not merely the story of human domination of nature, but as also the growth of consciousness of the possibility of human freedom. One may hope that if mankind still exists in 10,000 years, that along with remembering the great Maxwell, a certain contemporary of his, Karl Marx may also be seen to have played a significant role in ensuring the survival of the species beyond the crisis of capitalism. But I've gone on long enough.
Thanks
I
for
hope people could hear me.
Yeah, actually, after everyone turned videos off, it was crystal clear after that.
Okay.
So, James, if you want to do your response, go ahead.
Yes, I don't have any formal prepared remarks. I'm just serving as a respondent to Richard. And because we're already well past the time that I was supposed to give these remarks at, or this response to, I'll be as brief as possible so we can turn to a conversation and to audience questions. Can I ask Clay, can I be heard okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay. All right. So I want to begin by emphasizing, I want to begin actually where Richard begins, which is to refer to these two revolutions, the American and French Revolution, as siblings or as sisters, because they cannot, in fact, be separated, right? And the fact that they were separated is really an artifact of the 20th century, is really an artifact of the defeat and failure of socialism and the Cold War.
You're frozen.
Can people hear me okay?
Yeah, I think it's all good. I think it was just a pause that you made.
Oh, okay. So what I'm trying to say is that these revolutions were, in fact, as Richard says, siblings, sisters. The American French Revolution, they can't be separated. And their separation is really an artifact not of the later 18th and 19th centuries, but of the 20th century, of the defeat and failure of international proletarian socialism and the onset and development of the Cold War. In fact, a book I think well known to many Platypus members is Robert Palmer, R.R. Palmer's The Age of the Democratic Revolution, written in the 1950s and 1960s, written precisely against this kind of developing 20th century narrative in which the French Revolution was seen as wholly separate and indeed opposed to the American Revolution, and in which the French Revolution was seen as left-wing or radical and social, and the American Revolution was seen as wholly conservative, preserving, political. Um, I think that when Palmer tried to essentially explode that idea that these were two wholly separate and opposed revolutions, the American political, the French social, the American conservative, the French radical, I think that what he was arguing there would have been completely and utterly understood by classical Marxists, right? Would have been completely understood by Marx and Engels, understood by Bernstein, Kautsky, Bebel, so on and so forth. I think classical Marxists would have found it absurd that someone had to write a book in the mid to late 20th century saying that these two revolutions were in fact not opposed or diametrically opposite, but part of a common pattern of Western civilization of the Atlantic world in the later 18th century. So that is something I want to strongly emphasize, that these are indeed sibling, sister revolutions, that they are part of a common pattern of Western civilization in the later 18th century. However, I think it's very fair what Richard says that Platypus has tended to emphasize the American Revolution as opposed to the French Revolution. Although I don't think Platypus in any way, shape, or form denigrates or downplays the importance of the French Revolution. So the question is why? Why has Platypus emphasized the American Revolution? And here, I really want to pay homage to Richard's diamond-like intelligence because he answered his own question. In his talk, Richard said, the essential assumption of the Second International about the French Revolution was that it was both the successor to the French Revolution and that also had rendered it obsolete. In other words, classical Marxism conceived of itself as the successor to the French Revolution, the great revolution in the European world in the later 18th and early 19th century, but also as not simply fulfilling the French Revolution, but transcending, surpassing the French Revolution, rendering it obsolete. And what, of course, happened is that the proletarian socialist project with which classical Marxism was bound up, of course, classical Marxism was a critique of the proletarian socialist project, but it was a critique attempting to advance it, to further it, to clarify it. And that proletarian socialist project itself was defeated and failed and rolled back. And therefore, all of the assumptions built into that world of the Second International that would have, as Richard said, seen itself as the successor of the French Revolution, that it was both completing it, rendering it obsolete, those things have all fallen away. That is to say, I think we have to take seriously the transformation of world history that has happened since the failure and defeat of international proletarian socialism. And therefore, I think that placing the French Revolution, or as many Marxist and socialist groups do, placing this strong emphasis on the French Revolution at the expense of any other, is in some sense to be stuck in the past and not facing the regression, the regressed circumstances in which we lived. Now, Richard, in his presentation, adopted Eric Hobsbawm's notion of the short 20th century. That is, that the period from 1914 to 1991 could best be seen as the Russian Revolution and its failure and defeat through Stalinism and eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union. That, of course, is true as part of the wider history of the failure and defeat of proletarian socialism. But living as we do in 2026, it is also necessary to see the 20th century as the American century, as essentially amidst the failure and defeat of international proletarian socialism. The rise of the United States in between World War I and II, but most especially during and after World War II, to become a kind of global hegemon, securing the liberal world order, having become a kind of Bonapartist world order, but securing the liberal world order and creating a kind of unparalleled global hegemony. And therefore, I think that world history itself has developed such that the United States occupies a central position in it, which it did not occupy in the later 18th and 19th centuries, and that it has come to occupy. So I think world history itself necessitates a greater understanding of and confrontation with the American Revolution and its legacy. So in that broad sense, I think Richard has answered his own question. But moving on from there, I would also like to say that viewed retrospectively, we can say that the history of the rise and development of bourgeois society, I mean the whole history, not just the period of the emergence of bourgeois society, the heroic phase of bourgeois society, but also the period of capitalism, the tragic phase of bourgeois society, the phase of its contradiction and crisis. If we look at the whole history of bourgeois society since its rosy dawn in the late Middle Ages through to today, we can see that across its core, it's always had a kind of developing liberal world center. That is to say, especially after the Dutch Revolt, with the Dutch Republic, and then with the English Revolution of the 17th century, culminating in the Glorious Revolution of 1689, and a kind of Anglo-Dutch union, and then the kind of British Empire of Liberty, and then the American Revolution, and the Pax Britannica, followed by American global hegemony, the Pax Americana, we can see that bourgeois society has always had a kind of demigod at its center. As Marx says, I can't remember now if it's in the 18th Brumaire or the class struggles in France, right? That England or Great Britain is the demigod of the bourgeois cosmos, right? The demiurge of the bourgeois cosmos. In essence, there has always been a kind of this liberal demigod at the center of the bourgeois cosmos, from the Dutch to the Anglo-Dutch to the Anglo-British to the American moment. And therefore, I think it's extremely important to deal with the Dutch Revolt and the English Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, the British Empire, liberty, the American Revolution, the American Civil War, etc. I don't think that these things should be sidelined by any means. None of this, I want to stress again, is to dismiss the French Revolution. Another thing I would like to say is I think Richard is, of course, right that there is perhaps a reactive impulse amongst members of Platypus, and here I would include myself, against the kind of political correctness which is now kind of morphed into an even worse fresh hell, wokery. There is a desire amidst the kind of wokery of our moment, amidst the kind of Summer and George Floyd and the 1619 Project and all of that, to kind of have a kind of reactive defense of the American Revolution. But I would really insist that the education on the American Revolution is necessary, not as a defense of it, but because essentially we have to preserve the memory of liberalism. Again, I want to turn to Richard's own remarks, which I think explain why we in Platypus emphasize the American Revolution very well. Richard said towards the end of his talk, when he was talking about the bourgeois revolutions, he said, "For as long as modernity could be seen as pointing to socialism, the bourgeois revolutions could be seen as pointing towards socialism. With the decline of socialism, liberalism consumes itself, and historical memory becomes brittle and crumbles. Okay, that is to say, in our own in our own moment of extreme regression, right? It's not just simply that there's no memory of socialism. There's not even really a memory of liberalism in the classical sense. So I wholeheartedly agree with Richard when he says this is why the radical bourgeois philosophy section of the Platypus yearly Marxist reading group is so attractive to young people, because it is basically trying to recover a memory of the liberal revolutionary project, is trying to recover a memory of classical liberalism. And that is why it's so appealing to young people who are exposed to the Platypus reading group for the first time. That is the section on radical bourgeois philosophy. So I think that it is absolutely crucial to preserve and to educate people about classical or revolutionary liberalism of the 17th and 18th centuries, because I think that there's no possibility of preserving and educating people about Marxism without that education in liberalism. That is to say, without understanding the kind of world historical emancipation that the development of liberalism is bound up with, and the development of liberalism as a set of ideas is trying to make sense of. Without that, Marxism can in no way, shape, or form be understood. And that's why I think it's so crucial that we're doing, and we've done not only the radical bourgeois philosophy readings year in, year out, but we've also done a number of events like the American Revolution lecture series, like the liberalism lecture series this summer, which I think Richard is right, is bound up with also the American Revolution. Okay, can people still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I think that without preserving and educating people about revolutionary liberalism, it's impossible to make sense of Marxism. All right, simply put, I would just say this. You can solve, or you can basically understand every form of oppression and exploitation in the world simply with classical liberalism. Like the continuation of slave trafficking around the world, which still continues. The continuation of whole forms of brutal, oppressive labor regimes, the continuation of sexism, racism, what have you. All of this can be perfectly criticized, made sense of, criticized, and sought to be overcome within liberalism. You know, people have invented any number of nonsense, like, you know, post-colonialism and post-structuralism and, fourth wave feminisms, or any number of isms that are just surplus to requirements. Liberalism can get you to see, right, what's wrong with existing forms of every existing form in the world today of oppression and exploitation. You don't need anything else. But you need Marxism, because liberalism cannot make sense of the way that the world historical emancipation that it itself was bound up with, that it itself clarified to help to advance, itself has given rise to a form of unfreedom. You need Marxism. You need the work of Marx. You need classical Marxism to be able to make sense of the form of unfreedom, that bourgeois freedom, that liberal freedom, that bourgeois modernity, that liberal modernity itself generated, right? That is impossible for liberalism to make sense of, because for liberalism, obviously the advance of human freedom at an individual and collective level solves all problems, all social questions. Marxism is there to point out that it's this very advance of individual and collective freedom that introduces something that no one could have foreseen coming, a form of unfreedom that is itself a product of advancing freedom. As Moise Postone put it, a purely social domination, not a concrete personal domination, not an overt form of dependence, but a wholly abstract social dependence that free people, that bourgeois people, that a liberal bourgeois society generates over itself that comes to dominate itself. And so unless we preserve and continue to teach liberalism, including the American Revolution, of course, and the French Revolution, then there is really no hope for us to make any sense of what Marxism was or about. Marxism just gets reduced to a more extreme form of liberalism, that it points out exploitation and oppression. And Marxism just gets reduced to another form of post-structuralism or post-colonialism or feminism, claiming that liberalism was a lie, that it was always a mask worn by specific male or masculinist or heteronormative or bourgeois class or European imperialist or white supremacist interest, a mask of universalism, right? So if we want to prevent Marxism from being reduced to that kind of hysterical rad libism, right? Marxism to that kind of thing, we need liberalism, we need continuing education, liberalism, and an education in the American Revolution. Now, I just want to conclude basically with a question for Richard, if that's okay, if I have time. Would that be okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, Richard, I think you point to really a central issue, which I could not agree with more, which is you say that that in some sense the 19th century, the century of the French Revolution, you call it, from 1789 to 1889, is a century. I've lost the passage now. I apologize. Is a century of essentially this kind of critical awareness of the French Revolution. Here it is. Sorry. Platypus has a formula that capitalism is the crisis of bourgeois society. I would say that the left is the crisis of the bourgeois revolution. Intuitively, I think that it was a recognition of the critical character, critical in the sense of being a crisis, of the French Revolution at its most radical, that haunted what I'm calling the century of the French Revolution, 1789 to 1889. I could not agree with you more on that. I think that that is absolutely correct. And I also agree with your suggestion that the Jacobins are not simply behind their time, but they're also ahead of their time socially and politically. That is, I think we should see the phenomenon of the ascendancy of Jacobinism from 1792 to 1794 as the ascendancy of a set of people and ideas that were, in a broad respect, both behind and ahead of their time. But here's the question that I have for you, Richard, that I would like to begin your discussion with, which is the following. What do you make of the fact that Marx himself holds the Constantian critique of Jacobinism? And I ask, just to bear with me, because I'd like the audience to see the force of this question, I'd just like to read a couple of paragraphs from chapter 6 of Marx's The Holy Family of 1845. This is from Marx. Marx writes, Robespierre, Saint-Just, and their party fell because they confused the ancient, realistic democratic commonweal based on real slavery with the modern, spiritualistic, democratic representative state, which is based on emancipated slavery, bourgeois society. What a terrible illusion it is to have to recognize and sanction in the rights of man modern bourgeois society, the society of industry, of universal competition, of private interest freely pursuing its aims, of anarchy, of self-restrained natural and spiritual individuality, and at the same time to want afterwards to annul the manifestations of the life of this society in particular individuals, and simultaneously to want to model the political head of that society in the manner of antiquity. Here's the thing I particularly love. The illusion appears tragic when Saint-Just, on the day of his execution, pointed to the large table of the rights of man hanging in the hall of the Conciergerie and said with proud dignity, it was just this table that proclaimed the right of a man who cannot be the man of the ancient commonweal. And proclaimed with, I screwed up the quote, I apologize, and said with proud dignity, yet it was I who made that. In other words, Marx is talking about something that actually happened. We know this happened. Saint-Just, as he's being wheeled off ultimately to be guillotined, points to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and says, yet it was I who made that. And now this is Marx speaking. It was just this table that proclaimed the right of a man who cannot be the man of the ancient commonweal any more than his economic and industrial conditions are those of ancient times. This is not the place to vindicate the illusion of the terrorists historically. Profane history, on the other hand, reports after the fall of Robespierre, the political enlightenment, which formerly had been overreaching itself and had been extravagant, began for the first time to develop prosaically. Under the government of the Directory, bourgeois society, freed by the revolution itself from the trammels of feudalism and officially recognized in spite of the terror's wish to sacrifice it to an ancient form of political life, broke out in powerful streams of life. A storm and stress of commercial enterprise, a passion for enrichment, the exuberance of the new bourgeois life, whose first self-enjoyment is pert, light-hearted, frivolous, and intoxicating. A real enlightenment of the land of France, the feudal structure of which had been smashed by the hammer of the revolution, and which, by the first feverish efforts of the numerous new owners, had become the object of all-round cultivation, the first moves of industry that had now become free. These were some of the signs of life of the newly emerged bourgeois society. Bourgeois society is positively represented by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, therefore, begins its rule. The rights of man cease to exist merely in theory. What do you make of the fact, Richard, that Marx himself was a Constantian with regard to the terror?
Well, I don't think he was simply a Constantian, but I mean, again, one of the things that Francois Furet did that was helpful was to put together all of Marx's writings on the French Revolution. And I don't think one of the interesting things about the role of the French Revolution in Marxism, I don't think that Marx really came to a definitive answer to the French Revolution. I mean, he contemplated writing a history of the convention. I think that the history of the French Revolution that one thinks of as Marxist, or that is an extension of the liberal historiography, comes from later writers. And the problem is not, again, it becomes this question of first of all, I think in the original Constant version, that the illusion is, so to speak, an intellectual error, right? That sort of the problem is the Jacobins have misunderstood the nature of modernity. And that comes from Constant's basic liberalism.
Which is what Marx just said in the quote that I read.
Yes, but I don't think that Marx thought that you could reduce the Jacobin episode to a kind of mistake or a going wrong. I mean,
but Constant, just to very quickly, Richard, Constant doesn't think that either.
But like Constant, who was alive at the time, clearly was opposed to the Jacobins, and he's trying to explain Jacobinism, right? Yes, we are trying to explain Jacobinism. The problem of Jacobinism for the present is really the idea that Jacobinism might repeat itself, right? It's not the idea of ancient liberty, right? That there are these people in 18th century France and they think that they are reviving the Roman Republic, right? There's an obvious illusory quality. I mean, it took me a long time. I mean, I think to begin with, I always had an aversion to the Jacobins or to the French Revolution. And I found this talk about virtue and the ancient republics, I found it kind of repulsive because it seemed manifestly delusional. But as an intellectual problem, the real problem from the standpoint of the 20th century is a kind of revival of Jacobinism through the Bolshevik Revolution. It's striking how much the Bolsheviks, not just Trotsky and Lenin, and partly because they were Russian, but also because I think of the circumstances in which they found themselves. So I think that there is a deep fear that the problem of revolution or the problem of the left is not just liberalism. There's another Chris essay, the essay on Lenin's liberalism, right? I mean, and you could just as well speak about Robespierre's liberalism, right? In a fundamental sense, Robespierre was a liberal. right? But the government he presided over, right? It's while its principles in an abstract sense were liberal, were not liberal in practice, right? So the contrast between the values of the Jacobins and the sense of what of their practice and the you know I think like one of the things that's both fascinating and repulsive about the Jacobins is how much they remind one of a kind of bad leftism throughout the ages, right? It's like more tolerable in its original 18th century form, but the paranoia, the persecution, the infighting, right? That's why I said, if you want to judge it in terms of success, right? The American Revolution is obviously the more successful revolution. Establishes a successful bourgeois state. The revolutionaries don't murder each other. Uh, all of these things. And the United States is clearly the most successful country in history still, even if it is in some decline. It's still by far the most successful bourgeois society in history. And therefore, for that reason alone, the American Revolution is a world historical event. The French Revolution is actually of historical significance because of its failure, because of its crisis. It seems to me that what haunts the 19th century is this kind of violent beginning and counter-revolution and terror. There's the 19th century is haunted by that memory, and that memory is only overshadowed by a greater terrors that follow in the 20th century that come from different social forces.
I my ears were ringing a little bit or burning. I kind of have a response to both Richard and James, but more to Richard. And if you guys will bear with me, I didn't intend to serve as a respondent, but I wanted to just sort of clarify some things, which James did a very good job of representing the case. But let me just say a couple of things. So first of all, Marx definitely did come to a conclusion about the French Revolution, as is clear from his writings in 1848 and its aftermath. Marx agreed with Hegel, who agreed with Constant. And ancient liberty is indeed a problem today with the neo-republicanism of the millennials. So let's recall that Lenin said all analogies are lame. And so Trotsky should be bracketed or suspended, since although he used the French revolutionary analogies for the Russian Revolution, this didn't mean reading the Russian Revolution into the French Revolution. He never did that. Jacobins, therefore, were not ahead of their time, but indeed backwards. Robespierre defended private property. This is why he was not condemned by Constant, unlike other Jacobins, also because he was anti-war, unlike other Jacobins.
He was anti-war at one point, and then
in the Revolutionary War, the actual Revolutionary War.
He was anti-war for conditional political reasons.
He thought it would undo the revolution, which maybe it did, right? So the French Revolution was indeed backwards. There was an aristocracy and an official Catholic Church to overthrow, unlike in the American Revolution. And I would say the terror in the Russian Revolution happened not in 1936 or 37, but rather in 1918 to 1920, the Civil War. That's the actual terror in the Soviet Union in the Russian Revolution. And the problem with the discrete political event is that they invite inaccurate analogization. What matters is not particular historical event, but the overall process. As Constant said, the bourgeois revolution cannot be reversed. But the proletarian socialist revolution can and indeed was reversed, insofar as it took place at all. The Chinese Revolution, for instance, we can now say was a bourgeois revolution and not a socialist one. Tiananmen Square, for instance, marked the bicentenary of the storming of the Bastille, but it was crushed, and in the interest of capitalism, although its success would have likely also been capitalist. The 19th century was the century of Pax Britannica, and the 20th century was that of Pax Americana. Without the latter, without Pax Americana, there would have been no Soviet Union or Communist China. John Kennedy was right in 1960 when he said that they flowed from the American Revolution. in response to James, just to underscore some points that he was making, we in Platypus also emphasize the English Revolution. So James, of course, knows this to the point that he didn't mention it as essential background for both the American and the French revolutions. So the innovation pedagogically in Platypus, we might say, is that we do deal with the entirety of the bourgeois revolution, and that means seeing the English Revolution specifically as foundational for both the American and the French revolutions. And in Marxism's attempt to transcend and render obsolete the bourgeois revolution has been undone. It has been undone. Like that has been undone. And they've become conflated ever since the failure of proletarian socialism in the early 20th century. The rise and dominance of the US is indeed due to the collapse of socialism, which indeed has been the collapse of history. We emphasize the American Revolution and the English Revolution from the beginning of Platypus in response to anti-Bushism and anti-neoconism during the War on Terror and the project for a new American century in the 21st century. Pedagogically, it is important to deal with the non-diluted self-understanding of the bourgeois revolution. For instance, Abbé Sieyès and indeed Thomas Paine and Jefferson, as well as Locke and Montesquieu, and indeed Rousseau, Smith, Kant, and Hegel. The Jacobins are a misleading window into the French Revolution, into the bourgeois revolution. Similarly, the levelers, let alone the diggers, are misleading. Cromwell is not, although he was confused and agonized in his self-consciousness, but perhaps not in his actions. Hobbes is clearer-eyed, and Locke is even more so. The Founding Fathers knew what they were doing. So did Lafayette and Constant, perhaps also Napoleon. And it is the latter who is analogous to Stalin rather than the Jacobins. But the Bolsheviks were relegated to the role of Jacobins only unfortunately and tragically, that is wrongly, and not intentionally and rightly. That's my reading.
Okay, so again, if the analogy of Trotsky's analogy is accepted, then the terror is not the terror of the Jacobins, but the terror of the counter-revolution. Or the terror of the Thermidor, not the counter-revolution, right? If Stalin is Thermidor, then the real terror comes after Thermidor.
It would be the White Terror.
But it's not the White Terror. That's not Trotsky's analogy. The White Terror is pure counter-revolutionary terror. If Stalin is Thermidor, which is the problematic analogy,
the Directory.
Well, it would be the Directory or Bonaparte. It's a problematic analogy, but the analogy draws its strength from the association, the self-made association of the Bolsheviks with the French Revolution and the Jacobins, and a sense of an affinity to the problem. And again, I would say that your answer, Chris, confirms what, to me, I said, that essentially you are saying that the basic lesson is that the French Revolution was backward. We have to defend the American.
A non-self-deluded perspective is the best on the bourgeois revolution.
Right. So basically, you are saying that the
delusion then becomes the delusion of the left, which also Marx is not.
The left nowadays, okay, the left nowadays does not really think about or embrace Jacobinism. Jacobinism.
In the journal Jacobin.
The journal Jacobin has nothing to do.
No, they do. At the end of every article is a guillotine blade.
Yeah, but this is a gesture. It's like
they are confused about it, but the confusion is what's important.
The point is that there is nevertheless raised by the historical problem of the French Revolution and its connection to Marxism. I do not think that those bourgeois revolutions that had preceded the French Revolution would have given rise to a modern left on their own. And that is not because they were inferior to the French Revolution, but because it's precisely the way the French Revolution goes off the tracks, so to speak. It enters into a crisis that gives birth to the modern left. I'm arguing that it is the crisis of the French Revolution that is the birth of the modern left.
Okay, so what about 1848? And what about the Civil War? Meaning socialism in the United States really comes out of the failure of Reconstruction. That's when you get a real
Socialism, yes, but socialism itself
Isn't that
in
what
the
we're talking
United
about?
States. Okay, first of all, you can see the Civil War as the last successful bourgeois revolution in world history. You could argue for that. Second of all, the problem raised
Or it's like 1848.
again,
It's
Platypus
like
emphasized
1848.
1848 because as in two senses. One, it's as a sense of a turning point,
And
but
if it,
yes, it is a turning
the
point.
the left likes the Civil War and not 1776 because the Civil War is a failure. That's why they like it. And they dislike 1776 because it's a success.
No, they come on,
No,
Chris.
really, they
You
really
know,
do.
you know why they like the Civil War as opposed to it. And you could quote, Mark Twain was quoted on NPR the other day saying that 1865 should be celebrated and not 1776. So it's not like some modern invention. It's
What about
because the Civil War
1876?
addressed
What about
slavery.
1876? The
18,
defeat,
1876 meaning what are you referring
defeat, end of Reconstruction. The
Well,
compromise, the
who
compromise of
celebrates
the
that?
election of 1876. Well, I mean, it's not celebrated in the same way that 1848 is not celebrated.
But the historical problem, right? Yes, 1848, like 1918, represents a historical problem as representing failure, failure of revolution. But the problem posed by the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, and this is why they haunt the left, is that they are not defeated by the counter revolution. They are
No, they have an
defeated
internal
by,
defeat.
they are defeated by their own internal dynamics, and that is what is difficult to theorize. And
I
that
agree.
is why I personally keep being drawn back to them.
I think it's sad that we have to defend the American Revolution. I
I'm
think
not, I'm
it's so
not,
simple.
this was not intended as a conversation about the American Revolution. I brought up the American Revolution because James and I were in a bar in Manhattan on the 4th of July, and we were together when James was doing the filming
Yeah.
of, right. And I brought it up because I was making the link, which is a correct historical link and an obvious historical link between
hmm
the American Revolution and the French Revolution.
hmm
So my focus was essentially on the French Revolution. It wasn't about the need to defend the American Revolution.
Right.
And I
I'm
wasn't
talking about
attacking the American Revolution.
pedagogically, we are talking about the two now. And the only
We're
reason
talking
why,
about the two because they're a natural pair, as is the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution. That's there's a link between them.
yeah, there
And
is. Right. No, there
right?
is. I mean,
And
everybody knows that.
the problem of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, of not the American French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, is their crisis and failure.
Mm-hmm. No, the
Right?
French
And
Revolution needs to be examined that way. And I think that that's exactly what James was invoking from Marx. That Marx thinks
no, he
that,
was quoting Marx to say Marx agreed with Constant.
but meaning the criticism of the French Revolution is what's
It's not
necessary.
a criticism of the French Revolution, it's a criticism of the Jacobins
So, well,
specifically.
right.
Because the French Revolution, unlike the American Revolution, cannot be treated as a piece. And that's why it's difficult. You have to look at it year by year and stage by stage. I mean, even Burke is not really
he's not
ultimately
really against the revolution.
a total critic of the French Revolution.
Right.
If the
Right.
French Revolution had ended in, I don't know, June of
92.
1789, he probably wouldn't have been critical of it.
Mm.
Right, and in the Girondins wouldn't have been critical of it if it ended in 1791. Right, it's like when should it have ended, and
I think
how
that
would it
one of
have
the
ended?
things that you forget about the 20th century is that indeed, like conservative liberals were, it's tricky because of progressivism. I think that if there was no Cold War, if there was no Russian Revolution, I think that capitalism itself would have still presented a historical conundrum regarding the American Revolution. Meaning, I think that it would have been necessary for people to still criticize Jefferson. Meaning, like the way it's talked about now, that Jefferson, we're more sympathetic to Jefferson than Hamilton and his political vision, but it turns out Hamilton was correct about the real course of history and Jefferson was not. And that's a conservative perspective, right? And so I think that is independent of the Cold War. I think that and of course that goes back to
but in the 19th century, that attitude was
yes.
frankly conservative.
Yes.
But now, now the motivations for it are different. And when I said that, I was merely making a statement about what I thought the reality was.
I mean, the other problem about the left and why it's an important moment in 2026 is that the quote unquote left, as a function of the post new left and also as a function of further degeneration, has indeed taken on the right wing position. They have indeed taken on the Redeemer version of history. They've adopted.
Okay, but the preference for Hamilton. But again,
they have.
Again, Chris, Hamilton was not a counter-revolutionary.
He was not.
However, Adams was not a counter-revolutionary. The American Revolution did not turn on itself, right? So when you ask about a preference for, yes, let's open it up to questions.
Yeah, let's open it up to questions so we don't get stuck on this for like a while, just so we're able to kind of gauge the room a little bit. So if anyone wants to basically like raise hands, just raise do the hand raise gesture, and I can just call on you. Maybe just to start it off, I have a brief question of like, is there any defending any of these things, like in the absence of any struggle for socialism? I mean, it's easy to say that America is like the revolution that like won, but at the same time, when we were doing this documentary in DC, I was like interviewing a bunch of kind of centrist conservatives, and I started to feel sympathetic to kind of like the left perspective on the American Revolution, because none of these people were actually capable of defending it. Even people who gave a very sophisticated answer to like questions. So I don't like, is there a point to defending this thing if we're not like, if there is no struggle to socialism? I mean, maybe there's more of a point to defending the French Revolution as something that cleared away like aristocratic fetters than the American Revolution.
Okay, so I by the left position, I'm assuming you mean something like 1619, and I would just
point out
that a few decades ago, in fact, around the time of the bicentennial, that would not have been the left position. Second of all, this idea that the French Revolution was the more radical, that is not at all the position that I have been arguing for, or that one should be more sympathetic to it because it's the more radical, right? The people who say that, like, oh, the French Revolution destroyed a whole class, one, I would say that's actually in many respects empirically wrong, and it misses out the significance of the French Revolution. I'm really defending the importance of the French Revolution as a failure because of what it opened up in world history, ideologically. Because of the tensions it revealed in the bourgeois revolution and the tensions it revealed in liberalism. I mean, I suppose you could call that a defense. It's a very peculiar kind of defense. And it's a defense at the level of why we need to think about it, which was the point of this talk, not to attack the American Revolution. But that's probably not an answer. So I don't know what defending I guess Platypus defends the American Revolution. I don't know what defending the French Revolution would mean.
I
I
mean,
mean,
it is there because what Clay's saying is correct, which is that on the occasion of the 250th, the conservatives do find it necessary to drag out the French Revolution for another round of execution, right? And what Clay's saying is that their defense of the American Revolution, however, is weak, right? That the need to ritually attack the French Revolution is connected to the inability to defend the American Revolution. Whereas the left, in attacking the American Revolution and defending the French Revolution, they sort of avoid all the issues. Like they, kind of uh, gloss over a great deal. Whereas with the conservatives, you can see, that they're actually confounded in their ability or inability to defend the American Revolution. Like the attack on the French Revolution is kind of easy, from an
but
American
the,
conservative
the
standpoint.
attack on the revolution is the old one. I mean,
Yeah.
what's more significant is not the attack, but the failure of the left to defend it. And it's with the French Revolution, the attack is not like, oh, it's a counter-revolution. It's not even that it's bloody and terroristic or the precursor to totalitarianism. Nowadays, it tends to be almost like the French Revolution didn't really matter.
Well, I mean, France obviously doesn't matter, right? And so that's the other problem, is
But,
that
but, but
even in Pax Britannica, France was a second fiddle to Britain. And actually, that's the context in which James, the quote, the demiurgos to the bourgeois cosmos, that's the context in which Marx says that. In other words, Marx is saying, okay,
Marx,
France has had this revolution, but basically
Marx
France is
saying in the
subordinated to
19th
Britain.
century.
What'd you say, Richard? Sorry.
The 19th century.
Yeah, the
Marx
19th
is,
century, right.
yes, but that's not true at the end of the 18th century. It's not. Again, there's Platypus. There's. I feel constantly the need to bend the stick backward the other way.
Didn't Wellington defeat Napoleon?
What?
And wasn't he going to, no matter what?
That Britain was going to defeat Napoleon. Britain defeated Napoleon with the aid of half of Europe.
Yeah, with
and
the aid of the entire world.
And the French Revolution, again, like there is an emphasis here on the sense that France is this backward marginal country in 1789. It is not. It is the most important country in Europe, even more important in many respects, culturally, economically, and politically. I mean, there's a line of Crane Britons that I wanted to say, except that it's more technical, because we were talking about the Jefferson quote about the poverty of the French masses. And she says that France was a rich country at the time of the revolution, but it had a poor government. Right? It's true that compared the standard of living of the French peasants is miserable compared to that of an American yeoman farmer. But it's not a poor and backward or marginal.
No, the heights of the French economy far surpass those of the United States. And
but it even surpassed that in total terms and total resources, Britain, right? And this is one of the problems. And I wish we would talk more about like the French Revolution. One of the problems with the classical Marxist analysis is the argument that the bourgeois revolution is necessary for the development of capitalism. And you can argue in the empirical grounds that if anything, the French Revolution held back the development of capitalism, that it slowed it down until later in the 19th century.
Or you could say that, the tragedy of the French Revolution is even more so. I mean, you could say it's tied to the American Revolution, meaning the separation of the American and French revolutions from Britain. The fact that Britain had to play a counter-revolutionary role in both of the revolutions is the tragedy. It's the essential tragedy.
But if you look at the Jacobin episode, if you look at that, the Jacobin episode, if that is held up as the center of the revolution, not Napoleon, then that is not defeated by Britain. It's not defeated by counter-revolutionary Europe. It's really defeated from within. It's the problem of the continuity and the strength of the revolution. But we really should open up.
Can I briefly come back and I want to build on something Chris said earlier about the fact that we don't just emphasize the American Revolution, we emphasize the English Revolution and really the whole kind of Anglo-Dutch American world. Surely what you say about the French monarchy being the most important state in Europe in the late 18th century is fine, but Britain is the most important world. It's much more important on a world scale than France in the late 18th century. I mean, I half am driven crazy about what you said.
After
I mean,
the 7 Years'
Britain
War.
is so globally more important than France in the late 18th century. It's not even seriously imaginable. And one of the reasons, let me just finish the point. One of the reasons why the terror develops, and of course, I'm not saying the terror is reducible to this. So please, nobody in the audience misunderstand me. The terror is not reducible, what I'm about to say, but a necessary precondition of the terror is many of the French revolutionaries expected the support of Britain. To go back to Chris's point about Britain playing a counter-revolutionary role in the coming of the American Revolution and in the French Revolution. Many of the French revolutionaries were expecting the support of Britain. And indeed, there were, radicals and Whigs like Charles James Fox who wanted to be much more supportive of Britain, but they were not in command. Pitt the Younger, William Pitt the Younger was in command. And that necessitated that very much the absence of the backing of Britain. And indeed, Britain's ruling class subventing the crowned heads of Europe in their attempt to invade France, Austria and Prussia threatening to invade France unless, the monarchy was safe, etc. All of that role that Britain played conditioned a situation where once you had the revolutionaries having to fight all of the crowned heads of Europe, plus having to wage a civil war at home, particularly in the West in the Vendée, plus Britain subventing and supporting all of this, not just militarily, but even more importantly, financially, created the conditions of possibility for something like the terror to happen. So I just don't think you I don't think you can understand. These things are all deeply connected. I don't think.
Okay, I would just say briefly, because we're getting into the. So yes, the support of Britain, but the support of Britain would have been expected from the earlier, more moderate phase of the French Revolution. If the French Revolution had stayed as a French version of the Glorious Revolution, which is the way it looked originally,
what it was intended to be. Yeah.
Well, again, this is the idea that
including by the Jacobins, by the way, In other words, there's a moment in the era of the Committee for Public Safety where, basically the self-understanding of the Jacobins is that they have to do something different from the English and the Americans, because they are still dealing with the aristocracy in the church as well as the united reaction of Europe. Like, they themselves understand why they have to do what they have to do, and why they have to break with their models, because their models are, for the Jacobins too, the models are the English and the American revolutions. They feel like they're forced into this position. And then the younger Jacobins, the more starry-eyed Jacobins, are the ones who, who have to get intoxicated, as Marx put it, on images of Sparta. They don't start out that way.
Okay, several brief responses. The real intervention doesn't come till 1792 for a variety of reasons, some geopolitical having to do with Eastern Europe. The idea that the French Revolution the French revolutionary armies basically pushed back the external counter-revolution. The counter-revolution that threatens them is, first of all, the domestic counter-revolution in the provinces, the Vendée, the Federalist Revolt, things like that. But ultimately, what undoes the most radical phase of the French Revolution, the Jacobin Republic, Robespierre falls within the convention itself. Like all of this talk about foreign plots and so forth, you have to look at the internal social contradictions of Jacobinism. That's where Jacobinism fails, not the external attack. The same is true of the Bolshevik Revolution.
That's true.
Allied intervention is not what undid the Bolsheviks. What undoes them is their own social contradictions of the basis of their power. Now, the Bolsheviks have an explanation for it. Trotsky has an explanation for it, right? I tried to address that. I mean,
Right, the
again,
Jacobins don't, and that's why the Republic of Virtue is a desperate delusion. But
well, I mean,
it's what the
for
left
all we know,
likes, though.
the Bolshevik. I mean, you could at this point say the Bolshevik attitude. Trotsky was a desperate delusion too.
Well, maybe, but it would still be different.
But again, there is a lot of truth to the old Marxist notion that the fundamental contradiction of the Bolsheviks, not the Bolsheviks, excuse me, the Jacobins, was their dependence on private property, right? That the kind of revolution they wanted would have had to go beyond private property, beyond liberalism. And of course, France didn't have in other words, they would have had to jump ahead of a whole century of social development.
I don't know about that, Richard. To feed the starving masses of Paris might have meant like expropriating some people temporarily, but that wouldn't have meant overthrowing private
Yes,
property
and
per
there
se.
was and so
It would not.
the revolution at its most radical, the Ventose decrees just a few months before the Jacobins fall, they're going to confiscate the property of counter-revolutionaries, and it doesn't really come to anything. But these are again social
But that
democrats.
also wouldn't have been permanent. That would have been temporary.
Of course, it was temporary, and they weren't really enacted. And the point is that there is a narrative. There is a narrative, a classic Marxist narrative, that the terror was really the result of the Jacobins having a bourgeois conception. That it was that they were pushing ahead beyond that they were heroic, but that they were also pushing beyond what bourgeois society could deliver. The
Wait,
1889.
that contradiction is important, though, Richard. You said that the Marxist perspective is that the Jacobins have a radical bourgeois perspective, but then you also say that they're coming up against the limitations of their bourgeois perspective. But that's not actually true. What's true is that they can't fulfill their bourgeois perspective for material circumstances, not because there's something unrealizable about the bourgeois perspective.
The bourgeois perspective, in terms of, depends on what you mean by the bourgeois perspective.
Egalitarianism. In other words, if you look at the Committee for Public Safety, they're trying to stamp out corruption. They're trying to stamp out the counter-revolution. They're trying to stamp out corruption. And I always like to point out, like Danton was not a counter-revolutionary, but he was corrupt.
Okay, let's
go to other people. So there were a bunch of questions. Athene made some comment about theological and teleological. I don't remember saying either word.
I'll just read this Max Klein thing just because I know in the recording people won't be able to read the chat. So Platypus pedagogy focuses on the long arc of modernity by emphasizing the bourgeois revolution in Britain, the Civil War, and the Whig settlement of 1688 coming into crisis in the 18th century is framing the American Revolution, the bourgeois revolutionary era. How does the French Revolution fit into the historical arc of the Bourbon monarchy and its place in the modernization of Europe? Britain was the leading light of bourgeois revolution against French universal monarchic absolutism at the head of the global counter-revolution for most of the Enlightenment. Why did these roles reverse in both the French and American revolutions? How does the French Revolution take this history up or reject it? And if the left is the crisis of the bourgeois revolution, and the French Revolution exemplifies this most acutely first, hence its emphasis by classical Marxism, how does the left take up this prehistory of the French Revolution?
Well, so I don't understand the political rivalry between France and Britain as one of counter-revolution and bourgeois revolution. I see it as essentially geopolitical and commercial in nature. And obviously, Britain, for a whole bunch of reasons, was socially in advance of any other European country, and France was in some ways struggling to catch up. I mean, I will
politically backslid, though. There is what we call in Platypus pedagogy a crisis of the English Revolution in the 18th century.
Okay, but
one could say that both the American and French revolutions are a response to that.
Question, once again, Chris, the question was about France. I'm trying to answer the question about France. So So, I mean, I just would say that in many respects, France was also the classic country of the Enlightenment, despite, and I would also push back on two words that are, I think, misused: absolutism and feudalism. I don't think that the France of the 18th century can in any real way be called feudal, though how to describe what its social system was is, I think, a bit complicated. But
Aristocracy in the church is what's meant by feudalism. They're
yes,
continued that one.
and absolutism is also a misleading way to think about French politics of the 18th century, particularly the late 18th century. In many respects, if France really had been an absolutist state, you wouldn't have had the revolution, because part of what caused the revolution was the financial crisis because of aristocratic and other obstructionism through the Parlement. You had the Maupeou reforms in the early 1770s. And then Louis XVI, under aristocratic pressure, goes back.
Can I remind us of one thing, which is that the counterposition of the American and French revolutions is usually a counterposition of liberty versus equality. It's the counterposition of freedom versus equality as values. And I think that we should not accept that. In other words, we shouldn't say that the American Revolution is the revolution of liberty and freedom, and the French Revolution is the revolution of equality. That's where the Jacobinism comes in. And I think that that's simply wrong, meaning
Okay.
obviously the French Revolution is about liberty and freedom, and the American Revolution is about equality. Like, obviously, like, in other words, I'm afraid that, especially for our younger people, there's just this assumption that if we say bourgeois revolution, what we mean is bourgeois freedom, and we forget bourgeois equality. And if you forget bourgeois equality, then you basically conceded everything. That meaning our entire notion of equality is bourgeois. It's entirely bourgeois. There's nothing
It's
non-bourgeois or
equality before the
anti-bourgeois.
law, but there are also socialist notions of
No, I
equality.
mean, real equality.
Again,
Real
I don't.
equality.
Again, I
American revolutionaries did think about like the need to distribute property.
okay.
Like
Again, I don't.
they did.
Again, I don't think that there was anything in what I was saying that was an attack on the
No,
American
I'm not saying
Revolution.
that you're responsible for it,
And I
but
don't
we have to
feel
keep
that it's
this
a
in
response.
mind.
So to say liberty and equality, obviously the French Revolution, which was the main point of my talk, although I brought in the American Revolution as a comparison and the Bolshevik Revolution, believed in principle the Jacobins in both liberty and equality, right?
Yes.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
But if you
Right?
say that the French Revolution was ahead of its time, what you're saying is that it's ahead of its time in terms of equality. And what I'm saying is it's backward with
It's
respect
ahead
to
of its.
equality because the American Revolution didn't have to get rid of caste inequality, but the French Revolution did have to get rid of caste inequality.
I didn't
In
say,
that respect, it's different.
again, I do not speak about the French Revolution as a simple unity. I spoke about the Jacobins. If the whole goal of the French Revolution was to get rid of caste inequality, the Jacobins would have been unnecessary. The
Oh, they
earlier
need to
stages of
suppress
the
the
French Revolution.
vendue. That's where it's all coming from. They need to suppress the aristocrats in the church. They do. That's the Committee for Public Safety. That's what it's about, the Jacobins.
No,
It is, though. It is. And even the counter-revolution, the foreign armies are coming in on behalf of the church and the aristocracy and the monarchy. They are coming in for that reason. They're not coming in to defend
some
private.
of the support for the church was plebeian. A lot of it, a lot of the
Yeah,
religiously
yeah,
motivated, was
yeah.
among the masses,
Of
and
course.
again, I don't know.
It's not about the way that the left usually talks about it. I just wanted to include that in the mix because if we take that for granted, if we implicitly agree with the left that the French Revolution is more interesting because it's pushing for an equality that it couldn't achieve, then we really are being very anachronistic and not true to the facts of what happened and the self-understanding of the people, including the Jacobins. Right? Because even their like notion of radical equality is in the face of corruption, social breakdown. Like it's the radicalism of the French Revolution is not like proto-socialist. It really isn't. It isn't. I think that that's important because then you're in the realm of Alain Badiou, where people have always struggled for equality for thousands of years, including the apostles of Jesus, or Pythagoras' like communist colony in Italy, right? Like it's just not, it's not true to the actual revolution. It isn't.
Again, I will
James,
say, I never claimed, okay, let's try to get questions
But
from other people. I
would we
never
also be able
claimed the
to hear a
Jacobins were
response to this question from
proto-socialists.
James as well? Just because I
Yeah.
know this is kind of his zone as well. So the question
What's the
about
matter, sir?
this question about the reversal
Equality.
between France and England historically in terms of kind of like who's leading the world revolution.
Well, I think that the way the question frames it is broadly speaking correct. That is that obviously Britain is seen as this is why the Enlightenment is broadly understood until the era of the French Revolution as Anglophilic, right? As Anglophile, right? This is in part why Voltaire writes the philosophical letters. He has to explain to the continent after going to exile of England, what a free and revolutionary society England is. And indeed, people think because it doesn't have a powerful monarchy in an absolute sense, or a socially dominant aristocracy in the sense of the continent, or and that it has greater freedoms of press, greater political conflicts and debates. People think that England is going to fall apart. And it's Voltaire who has to explain to the continent in philosophical letters that, in fact, this is the source of its great strength at home and abroad, is its developing social and political freedom. But Richard, can I say one thing, which is you have this argument of the Jacobins being both ahead of their time and behind their time. And
Yeah.
I obviously agree, as you know, we've debated this for years, with the Constant point, which I also believe is a Marx point, right? Which is to say that they're behind their time in a sense of this idea of ancient democracy, okay, that comes into place. But what I took you to be suggesting when you said that they were ahead of their time is that somehow in the 19th century, people look back at Jacobinism because it seems to raise the question of the radical transformability of society. Am I understanding you or misunderstanding you on what
No,
you
I think you're exactly understanding me. And I just will point out that in admiration for Sparta, I mean, ancient Sparta was obviously not a democracy, right? Like it's sort of bizarre that radical Democrats would admire the most aristocratic, undemocratic of the Greek city-states, right?
Ancient democracy is aristocratic.
Again, I actually have a lot of disagreements about that, but that's not my point. So I think James's formulation is correct. Again, I feel that trying to think about the relationship of the left, including Marxism, and talking about the French Revolution, is inherently treated as suspicious in Platypus as casting aspersions on the American Revolution. Again, I said this was a Bastille Day conversation, and I was basically trying to talk about the French Revolution. I don't think you can just talk about the French Revolution as a single thing. And
It's a
therefore,
misrepresentation of the French Revolution too, though, potentially. I'm not saying that you're misrepresenting it at all. What I'm saying is what we're dealing with in the world, in other words, bracketing the American Revolution entirely, we're still dealing with the fact that the French Revolution tends to be misrepresented both on the left and the right.
I think that the view of the French Revolution on the right is sort of more or less continuous. I think that to a certain extent, I'm struck by the way the right, for example, the French right, has even forgotten about the French Revolution, and that's because I think that the French left has, for a generation or so, been unable to think about the French Revolution, and
If
in
they
that
downplay it.
and the reason for that very obviously has to do with the fall of communism or Stalinism, right? It has to do with a political movement that you can go back, I mean, Francois Furet in the 70s, 1978. You and I were kids. James was born then. That's right. But again, that's the moment. It's a moment of rightward movement that rejects the old Marxist analysis, which actually was previously inherited from liberals. Now, I'm actually ambivalent about the old Marxist analysis of the French Revolution, the old class analysis. I think it actually has a lot of merit. I don't think it's just vulgar, but I also see the problems with it, and I can see the strength of some of the revisionist critique.
It seems that, by the way, is Kautsky's pamphlet on the French Revolution translated into English? I'm not sure that it is. I don't think so.
I'm not sure which pamphlet you mean. I mean,
Kautsky wrote
there are
something in
books.
1889, and it doesn't seem to have been translated into English. And so we have Jean Jaurès' history of the French Revolution, which is quite
Which
interesting.
Kautsky was very critical of.
Kautsky, yeah, but Kautsky was, a Marxist. I mean, he is the Marxist. He's the Pope of Marxism, and it's the founding of the Second International. And he is trying to, as James pointed out, and as you pointed out, indeed, Richard, that the idea was that the Second International would transcend the French Revolutionary tradition in some definitive way, in a way that the Paris Commune didn't and 1848 didn't. Blanqui and Proudhon did not really. And so Kautsky is critical, but he's also not condemnatory of the French Revolution by any means.
He's not condemnatory. That's why I described the attitude, right?
Right.
And really the attitude, the revival historiographically of the French Revolution, people like Ollard and Mathieu, comes out of a left French republicanism,
Yes.
and then
which Jaurès has to respond to, by the way. That's who Jaurès is responding to.
I think Jaurès is in many ways like also a product of that left republicanism. And it's very hard to draw the boundaries between that left republicanism, socialism, communism, Marxism.
He's taking it away. He's saying that it doesn't belong to them, though. He's saying it belongs to the socialist movement, the left republicanism. And so that's why I actually, because I went in reading the Jaurès, wondering whether I'd like it or not. And in fact, I do. Because it's opposed to the Kautsky. Anyway.
Let's try to answer other people's questions.
I'm going to do Kana and James, and then we can do Lori because they've submitted these questions kind of early, but I'm going to bundle Kana and James's questions together just because they're similar themes. What did the divisions of the French Revolution tell us? What are we to make of Danton, the Girondins, and the Enragés? The Mensheviks and even early Trotsky identified Lenin as a Robespierre figure, implicitly aligning themselves with the fallen moderates. How does the memory of the Jacobin purges affect the trajectory of the Russian and global Marxism post 1903? And then James Calloway's question is: isn't the primacy of the French Revolution for the left just its seeming problematization of the social question? And we're comfortable with that as opposed to the American Revolution because we're tortured by the problematic of that question and thus reject society as associative capitalism, which is essentially rejected in the American Revolution. So there's a difference between you, Richard, and Chris here, presuming one, perhaps wrongly, that you're less comfortable with the bourgeois revolution, singular, versus the bourgeois revolutions than James-Chris.
So I guess like the first question about the Jacobins and the Girondins and then the Enragés. So, I mean, to simplify, well, the Girondins stand to the left of the Jacobins and the Enragés are to the left, or rather the other way. Girondins to the right, the more moderate, the Enragés to the left. Again, you have to be a little cautious with these categories. I mean, one phenomenon, certainly of the French Revolution, that bears repeating and emphasizing is the bourgeois character, both ideologically and socially, of both Jacobins and Girondins, and the difference between them being largely that the Jacobins were more susceptible to left-wing pressure from the street. Whereas, in a sense, the Girondins represented a more purely bourgeois, purely liberal version of the revolution. It seems to me the large part of the logical response to what Chris and James are saying is that really we should root for the Girondins, and that would have been the correct answer. I mean, to the revolution. I mean, that's the kind of the bottom line of Jonathan Israel, that the Jacobins were.
That's not really right. In other words, I do think that Robespierre is not simply wrong but tragic, and I think that uh, the fall of the Jacobins is tragic. Meaning it's not like the victory of the Girondins. I'm not even sure what that would mean. You know, Circumstantially that was impossible, but also principally there's no particular reason to favor the Girondins other than the self-understanding.
Okay, so let me just explain. So you don't really have political parties in the French Revolution. You have groupings, ideological groupings. So we have to be a little vague. I've thought about this question because you have in the historiography of the French Revolution people like Olar, who was the hero, was Danton, Mathieu was Robespierre, right? I don't I don't think that it's really possible to choose a hero or a right group, right? I don't think that seeing the perspective of the French Revolution from Robespierre works. You can read the Russian Revolution through Lenin and Trotsky. You can read the American Revolution, in a sense, through all the founding fathers. The French Revolution is hopelessly fractured and divided, and it hopelessly fractures and divides our loyalties. It's a very uncomfortable revolution in that respect. I don't know, the question about like the singular versus the plural. I mean, I suppose there is a question there of philosophy of history. Um, I don't know. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Lori, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, I was just trying to write it out in order to be a little bit more clear what I was trying to get to. I'm saying my question is very basic, because I want for a moment to like put aside the ways that the left has abused the French Revolution, and I want to go back to something that kind of was just passed over really quickly with regards to Hegel and Marx and how they understood the core political contradiction of the French Revolution. And yeah, since it was kind of dropped, but moved past quickly, I still thought that it was an important pedagogical point from a platypus perspective. So it has to do with how clarifying this question of it being ahead of its time, but also tragic because of how it expresses the moment of a particular problem of the state and how the left is basically born in this moment, but it's also born into this like self-made crisis and was never able really to overcome that contradiction by the time of the Russian Revolution. So it kind of haunts the entire 19th century and of course the 20th. So like I was trying to get at like if because maybe it's three different perspectives like of understanding of like this core contradiction that actually expresses itself clearly in the French Revolution. And then it becomes a problem that maybe of course there's multiple contradictions, but I was trying to kind of get to like that point of like really what is that is unique that we wouldn't understand if we didn't have the French Revolution.
I would say we probably wouldn't understand the modern left. So there are three answers. You mentioned the crisis of the state. I think it's really ultimately about a crisis of society more than the state. Hegel is an interesting question. I mean, in some ways, Hegel is an even more subtle Constant. I think that Hegel, in his totalizing way, unites 1789 and 1793, the overcoming and the crisis. So there is a parallel there, a very distant parallel, between the classical Marxism of the Second International. As for Marx, I mean, I don't want to get polemical. I do not really think that Marx had a definitive answer. I know that the official Platypus line is Marx was just a Constantian. I think that even when Marx uses that language, he means something different from Constant, because Marx was a socialist and Constant was a liberal. But
Richard, I don't ask this rhetorically, but could you spell out? That was my question from you before. I understand your point there, that you think that Marx is in some sense not merely repeating Constant, but going beyond Constant. Could you spell that out in more detail?
I think Marx sees Constant as what he is, a liberal, but also in that sense a bourgeois ideologue who represents the 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 perspective of the liberal bourgeoisie. Now, given the time he's writing and the time, particularly in the early years when Marx is starting to think about the revolution, the closeness of the liberal position and what will become the Marxist position are very clear. In other words, there's very little tension, right? It's in the 20th century that there's a break or a split potentially between the liberal and the Marxist position. And even in the late 19th century, after the Second International, there's still again that sense of the overcoming, right? That it's both 1789 and 1793, right? But both are overcome in some higher synthesis. Now, given the historical period, I think that Hegel understands that through ultimately a kind of gradual transformation, a victory of the bourgeois revolution, despite the Reformation, right? So both Constant and Hegel, I would say, are coming from a liberal perspective. Hegel seems to me, predictably, to have the deeper world historical sense, maybe even the more optimistic sense, and a sense that is ultimately more ambivalent because Constant seems more narrowly and precisely a liberal. That's a little vague, but I don't know if that was helpful.
How do you see Marx as differing essentially with the Hegel perspective and even more importantly, the Constant perspective? Because you were suggesting, I take it, see the point that, especially in the quote I read, Marx is rehearsing the Constantian and to some degree the Hegelian critique. So I'm asking, your initial response to that was, yes, that's there, but there's more there than what you're suggesting. And I guess I want to know the more there, why you think Marx isn't, or in some sense is disagreeing with the Constantian critique, or at least going beyond it.
It feels to me like there's a yes and movement, right?
Give me the and. Okay, can I have the and?
The and is essentially the content of the future socialist revolution. That ultimately Constant's vision of modernity is one of the triumph of liberalism, liberal commercial society as a kind of resting endpoint to history, right? That may have been Hegel's own conscious understanding, probably was, but there's also within Hegel and the whole Hegelian system resources for going way beyond that and could be adapted to Marxism. I think that with Constant, the truth or falsity of Constant's vision depends largely on the extent to which one feels the possibility of a socialist transformation of the world, right? That if there is possible still a socialist transformation of the world, then those aspects of the Jacobins that seem purely anachronistic and backward looking might also contain within them a utopian, future pointing character. I have to look at Marx and quote chapter and verse, but I think that Marx had, I hate to use this word because I hate it, a more dialectical sense about the Jacobins than Constant. Constant says basically the task of modernity, the task of the 19th century is liberalism, and the Jacobins are an obstacle to liberalism because they have these these ridiculous anachronistic notions. They dress up in the they imagine themselves in ancient republics. And obviously, we don't live in ancient republics, and there's a misconception of the nature of modern freedom, right? That misconception can really be understood as ancient versus modern is something that I would question. Meaning that did the ancient world really have that conception of freedom? Or did
Richard, can I pose an unfair question to you?
Sure.
Is your perhaps deepest concern here that the recovery of liberalism by Platypus is not really bound up with an attempt to recover Marxism and socialism? Is that the ultimate concern you have?
I suppose, or maybe, it's my temperament. I mean, we've had this private joke going for a long time that you're a Whig Trotskyist and I'm a Tory Trotskyist. I mean, there is in me perhaps an underlying skepticism about the unconditional value of modern freedom and liberalism. But there's also a sense, equally strong or stronger, that the only way out is through, right? And that the transformation of the world is irrevocable. But there is temperamentally a question raised there.
Aaron Bow.
Hi. Sorry if I missed a little bit of the original talk, so sorry if it's kind of like retreading some ground. But I guess not. So this is connected to the previous question. But I always found Marx a little bit difficult with the French Revolution because on the one hand, like we've talked about, he repeats the Constantian criticism, so he has kind of like the liberal critique of the French Revolution. But at the same time, he is also representing this like socialist political tradition that does see itself like squarely as followers of the Jacobins. And so there's this like Spartacus League pamphlet about Marx and neo-Jacobinism. And so with Marx, it's like there's this really difficult thing where he like has a liberal critique of the Jacobins while the other side putting himself in its like political legacy at the same time. And I was kind of curious how you thought about that because also maybe just to add on something like with Lori's question of like what would happen if like the French Revolution didn't exist. And sort of like if, say, you just had the successful bourgeois revolution in America, then the Industrial Revolution, you actually might not get Marxism. But somehow it's like this failed French Revolution, and it's particularly like political strand in this French Revolution. It's like that plus the Industrial Revolution that gets you Marxism, actually. So I was just kind of curious what you thought of that.
Yes, I agree completely with that. That's a very good statement summary of basically what I'm saying. Yes, I think that Marxism depends upon that neo-Jacobinism at the same time that there's a critique of the Jacobins. And I think that by the late 19th century, the problem of the contradiction seems resolved by the synthesis of the Second International, that we are the continuers of the French Revolution, but we've overcome it. We inherit both 1793 and 1789, but we're going to go beyond both. Except that history didn't work out that way in the 20th century, and that's why the French Revolution comes back to seem as a problem. In a different way than it was in the century of the French Revolution, where it was more felt as a living problem that tasked Europeans with the transformation of their own societies, whereas in the 20th century, it became a historiographical problem. It became a problem of understanding what the meaning of the transformation was. And indirectly, it became a way of thinking, to a large extent, about modern liberal democracy and the Bolshevik Revolution and socialism and communism.
And maybe just have a follow-up or kind of like a hypothetical question. Like if the French Revolution, or if, say, there wasn't any Jacobinism, do you think this would have like, I guess there probably wouldn't have been Marxism, But do you think that this means that some kind of utopian element of what would become Marxism would be absent, like given your previous remark about the Jacobins? Or do you think, like, what do you think would be possibly missing that, yeah, I guess.
I think that the strong political drive of Marxism, and the is something that it inherited from Jacobinism, while being critical of the Jacobins specifically. I mean, it's hard to say, what the counter history would be. I think that it's the ways in which the French Revolution was contradictory, more so obviously than the Anglo-American and other bourgeois revolutions, that prompted the kind of reflection and groping that led to Marxism. I mean, again, it's very hard to predict. The classic statement about British political economy, French politics, which is ultimately derived from a Jacobin tradition and German philosophy, right? I mean, maybe the British political economy would have developed anyway, and the German philosophy is in large part a reaction, a kind of to the world historical phenomenon of the French Revolution. You see that in both Kant and Hegel, I would argue. I don't know.
I'm gonna bundle Ethan and David's questions together. And I don't necessarily actually want to flatten Ethan's question in doing that because David really gets into modernity in a way Ethan's question doesn't necessarily. But they are touching on similar things. So Ethan's question is, what is the significance of late Jacobinism, not neo-Jacobinism, but Babeuf and the Conspiracy of Equals? Does Babeuf, Mareschal, and Buonarroti embody the contradictory Jacobin moment that Richard raises? Do they already have one foot in the 19th century? And then David's question is, Horkheimer talked about a kind of bourgeois critique of egoism as having a demagogic function for the Jacobins. And already by the late 1820s, Buonarroti talked about 1789 as a revolution divided between the order of equality against the order of egoism, even talking about the working class versus the capitalists. Horkheimer points to how, in this way, the French Revolution seems like a rehearsal for fascism. This idea isn't as readily mapped onto the more bloodless, more practically motivated, more successful, apparently more liberal American Revolution. If today the meaning of the bourgeois revolution is just as much the rise of capitalism as it is humanity's self-emancipation, isn't there something necessary about the counterposing of 1776 and 1789 after the failure of Marxism, whether by the dead left's assumptions or Platypus bending the stick?
Okay, I think I'll bypass the 76 and 89 question because I think it's been raised enough by my argument with Chris. The question about late Jacobinism and the foot in the 19th century, I'd say yes. It is a bridge, right? Like that is the significance of Babeuf. The significance of Babeuf is not of a concrete political phenomenon, but of an intellectual bridge. Same with Buonarroti. There is like a handing on of a tradition and its mutation. And what's significant about Babeuf is the dawning of a consciousness that Jacobinism, by not adequately addressing the social question and limiting itself to a regime of private property, is undermining itself, right? And in its own moment, that represented a fantasy, but in the longer historical view, it could be seen as prescient and anticipating modern socialism. The point about the Horkheimer, I've encountered this view before that Jacobinism anticipates fascism. I mean, you actually see a bit of this in Jonathan Israel. He doesn't bring up fascism, but it's a sort of populism. I understand why people see that analogy. I always feel it as a bit intellectually dishonest. I don't think Jacobinism, first of all, actual fascism hated Jacobinism. I brought up the point about Bastille Day, and you wouldn't celebrate Bastille Day under Pétain. The Nazis saw themselves as the antithesis of the French Revolution. There are, of course, nationalist, populist, authoritarian elements in Jacobinism. I think the real historical analogy that to Jacobinism would be the question, does Jacobinism anticipate Stalinism? Or does it anticipate other forms of what Platypus would call bad leftism? That I think is a more plausible historical analogy than Horkheimer's association of it with fascism, which I've seen in other places. Hello?
David has a follow-up question.
Oh, the point about Robes, it's not just Robespierre and the Jacobins, but Calvin, Luther, Savonarola. Yeah, I mean, to me, that stuff is confused. I'm not gonna, I think Horkheimer makes a mash of history there.
For people just listening and not able to see the chat, David followed up just saying per Horkheimer, it's not just Robespierre and the Jacobins, but Calvin, Luther, Savonarola, bourgeois and democratic reformers and leaders and all of them.
But by the way, Robespierre was not a dictator in the way we think of totalitarian dictators now, right? You can speak of the Jacobin governments as a dictatorship, but the character of its falling and the role that he played, it wasn't like a fascist dictatorship, right? You can speak of the terror, but it was not similar in character to fascism.
Just to add to what Richard's saying, it's a kind of democratic republican dictatorship. That is to say, the convention is recognizing that they have to conduct both an international war and a civil war at the same time. And they have to create a kind of executive within the legislature. So they create this 12-man committee of public safety, granting it emergency powers. But at all times, the committee of public safety, Robespierre's power over the Committee of Public Safety is purely charismatic. He's a great speaker. He's persuading them in their meetings to go along with what he wants. He's not forcing them to do anything. And at all times, the Committee of Public Safety's power flows from the convention itself, the main legislature of Republican France. And Robespierre is also, Thermidor is not a coup, it should be emphasized. That is to say, Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, the Jacobin power is voted away by the convention.
Right. And that's, by the way, why Thermidor was such a blow to the French left. Because to have staged an insurrection against the government would have been an insurrection against the convention itself, which was the source of revolutionary legitimacy. That's why the sans-culottes, the radical sans-culottes, were disarmed by Thermidor so much. They would have had to rise up against the convention, and they couldn't do that. They were psychologically disarmed. More questions?
Raise hands if you have a question. Aaron again.
Yeah, if nobody else has any questions, I think, but just to kind of like David was just saying this when like Horkheimer and I think also Adorno, when they talk about Jacobinism as a precursor to fascism, like it's of course a little bit unfair, but I think a lot of times, and also like in this comparison to like Savonarola, like I think the idea is that like Jacobinism represents like petty bourgeois fanaticism or something like that. And that like you can look back and I don't know, like people will say that Tucker Carlson sounds like
lots of things
yeah, like these sorts of things.
fascism.
But yeah, but I think I don't know, I was curious if you saw any
Yes,
yeah.
lots of things resemble fascism in different ways that are not fascism. The idea of petty bourgeois fanaticism, as the Jacobins, has, of course, like a strong element of truth. And it was also in many ways the view of the Second International, right? That was made very uncomfortable by the terror. There are many aspects of the Jacobins, including Robespierre, that should be repugnant to people, right? There are lots of very real and obvious problems with the Jacobins. And I'm not here to defend the Jacobins. I don't think, however, that it is either fair or historically accurate to see the Jacobins as precursors of fascism. I would argue that actually fascism comes from exactly the opposite tradition in European politics, the counter-revolutionary tradition that emerges with the French Revolution. Those are the people whom ultimately fascism descends from.
Richard, can I say something, and it follows up on some points that people are putting in the chat? I believe it's David and others. Um, I think there's no question that in a self-conscious political way, fascism, Nazism cannot be seen in as any tradition with Jacobinism. In fact, the Nazis view themselves as the overturning of 1789. That's actually a phrase of theirs, that they're overturning the world created by the revolution of 1789. But I think what's being raised is a sense in which, listen, there's no question that the terror begins defensively, dealing with genuine counter-revolutionary forces at home, dealing with the Civil War at home, dealing with counter-revolutionary and foreign forces trying to invade from abroad. There's no question that the terror is in its initial instance a war measure. But there is the critique that is put forward that the terror becomes kind of has a kind of almost a train that runs out of control, that just continues down the tracks, a self-perpetuating logic where people want more blood, they're baying for more blood, and it becomes a kind of, you know this well. Thomas Paine was about to be guillotined. He had to be saved at the last minute. That is, there's a sense in which there's a kind of fulfilling of deeply simultaneously democratic and authoritarian discontents are being fulfilled in the terror. Can I pose the question to you that way?
Yes, I agree with that. And I think
so. In some sense, you do agree with the Horkheimer point.
No, I disagree with the connection to fascism. I agree. Like, what I actually am sympathetic to is something like the Jacob Talman view of like a liberal democracy and totalitarian democracy. There is an aspect of totalitarian democracy in Jacobinism. There is some truth in that. And one can go further back and see roots of this. And again, I'm not blaming Rousseau. One can see roots of that in the Rousseauvianism and the notion of the general will. But I also think it's important here, and here's where I'm going to be more of a traditional Marxist. I think it's important. One does not have to validate the self-conception of the Jacobins about foreign conspiracies and this and that, to see that the Jacobins, in their own sometimes misguided way, did represent a radical democratic impulse. And that their defeat was a defeat for a radical democratic impulse. What I find problematic about the Horkheimer is it doesn't seem to recognize the difference of historical context. That he bundles in, Robespierre and Savonarola and all of these people on basically psychological grounds. There are all sorts of phenomena. Stalinism resembled fascism in many ways. I don't think it is helpful to understanding Stalinism to just point out its resemblances to fascism. There are all sorts of people who, the term fascism is thrown about very loosely today, right? And people are, described as fascist. And again, I don't think that that's helpful. So yes, I agree with this point about the terror. By the way, I think that the amount of the idea that the terror is simply a product of foreign intervention and counter-revolution, again, raises problems. And the similar thing might be said about the Bolsheviks. But this is, I don't want to go down that route. But I'm not defending the self-conception of the Jacobins. I'm not denying that the Jacobins were problematic in all sorts of ways, right? That the terror was a huge problem, that it's repulsive. I'm not even claiming that the terror was just necessary. I'm saying that the real historical significance of the Jacobins was the radicalism of the Jacobin moment. And its historical after effects. If it had just been a radicalism of the Jacobin moment and it had not had historical after effects, then it would not be as significant. But it did. And perhaps the fact that it happened in Europe and the fact that it happened in the most culturally significant country in Europe had all sorts of effects all over Europe in the continent that basically came to dominate the world. And it had effects in the United States, too. But it dominated, in that sense, the whole thought of the 19th century. Because it made possible all of the ideological developments of the 19th century.
Richard, I say this in response to you, and it's not an attempt to offer some kind of compromise, but really just further clarification by synthesis. That is to say, what I think I'm concerned about, and more broadly, I think what Chris is concerned about, when we're emphasizing the fact that there are backward conditions in France relative to the Anglo-Atlantic world, that the French revolutionaries are having to deal with a whole order of a state society. Yes, you're right. It's not a feudal society anymore, but there's still immense, caste and estate distinctions are written into law. There's immense feudal vestiges. There's an entire order of a highly powerful established Roman Catholic Church. There's censorship of the press. There's a very powerful absolute monarchy in the sense that it conducts a police state in effect, and there's a very entrenched aristocracy and its privileges. That is to say, a lot of the violence of the French Revolution is actually confronting the backwardness of France compared to the Anglo-Atlantic world. And what a lot of leftists take out of it, and what I fear a lot of Gen Z get out of it, violence itself is radical. And that's why I think it's so important for us to point out to an important degree that the very bloody mindedness and violence of the French Revolution is not a condition of its more radical or advanced character, but as a condition of the more backward conditions, the much more powerful Ancien Regime setting in which the French Revolution unfolds. The obstacles, the barriers to its development are really, really powerful. And so a lot of the bloodiness and violence of it is not simply because it's more radical or forward-looking, and we leftists should all embrace violence, right? People do draw those awful conclusions from it, and I know you're not saying that. But I also take, Richard, your point to be that the defeat of the French Revolution, in particular the defeat of the Jacobins, becomes a kind of recipe for a certain kind of conservatism regarding the transformability of the world, and what the left and going up through and including to the Second International wanted to hold open about not just the French Revolution as a whole, but the actual radical Jacobin moment within it is the question of the transformability of the world, right? That is what you mean by the simultaneous backward and more advanced character about Jacobinism. That's what I take from it, Richard. But let me hear your response.
Well, that's generous, and I will accept that. And I would just say, though, on the question of backwardness, that again, if the question ultimately becomes, okay, why didn't the French Revolution stop, say, in 1791? Okay, and you can say, well, it's because of the émigrés, it's the obstreperousness of Louis XVI, it's about the Nuit de Varennes, it's all of these things. But at some level, there is some dynamic that the French Revolution starts going, and it starts getting more and more radical, and it can't stop. And it's true that the counter-revolution radicalizes the French Revolution. It's true that foreign intervention, which doesn't happen until 1792, could be seen as radicalizing the French Revolution, right? In that sense, by the way, I would argue that Robespierre's prediction about the consequence of revolutionary war was wrong, as was that of his Girondin opponents, of the Brissotins, etc. That they were both wrong about what they thought the effect of the war would be. But I don't think that you can. There are advantages to backwardness. That is also one of the peculiar lessons of the Bolshevik Revolution, that there are intellectual and spiritual advantages to backwardness. And again, I will say, yes, of course, France in many ways socially was backward compared to the Anglo-American world. But it was not that backward. It was not as backward as Russia was in 1917 compared to Western and Central Europe. And I think that focusing on the question of the backwardness and the caste structure and the feudal elites, I think that it's distorting as to the nature of the problem. In some ways, it lets the Jacobins off too easily, and in other respects, it minimizes what they did. I'm not sure if I'm clear in my answer, but otherwise, I generally agree with your comment and your summary. Does that help, James?
Yeah, no, I don't. I don't. I don't disagree with that. I mean, it seems to me that actually, let me just. I don't disagree with what you said. We're in agreement about the points you made there. What I would say, and I think you would agree with this, Richard, is although you call the Constant critique as a critique from the right, I think you would agree with what I'm about to say, which is we should not confuse the Constant critique with the Burke critique.
Yes, of course. Constant is obviously to the left of Burke. When I say Constant is a critique from the right, I don't mean to say that Constant was a right-winger, that he was a reactionary, that he was a right. Quite the contrary. I'm saying that within the spectrum of the French Revolution, right, it's not as though the left and right are absolute things. I'm speaking relatively. Within the spectrum, his criticism of the Jacobins can be described as a critique from the right. And I'm trying to say that neutrally. I'm not saying that discredits Constant. I'm not saying that the most left-wing people are right. Okay, Constant understood something about the French Revolution that none of the Jacobins did, right? And I'm willing to give him a huge amount of intellectual credit and much prefer reading Constant to Robespierre or whatever. They're not interesting. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't say, well, what is the political direction? I feel like I constantly have to, I'm in this conversation, I'm constantly defending myself against the idea that I'm upholding the French Revolution against the American Revolution, that that's the point of this conversation, and that I'm therefore giving license to all sorts of Gen Z bad leftism. And I really don't think there was anything in what I said, despite Chris's response to it.
Richard, I wasn't saying
No,
that.
you didn't say that at all, and I was very grateful for your response. You are actually very generous in your response. I expected more pushback, but I'm saying that in terms of the general conversation. So and again, I feel like I'm trying to formulate what it is about the French Revolution that should hold our interest, right? It's not about defending the French Revolution or criticizing the American Revolution. It's why does the French Revolution matter? And and that one even has to say that, right, is paradoxical because for a long time the importance of the French Revolution was self-evident. But it's certainly not self-evident now, and it hasn't been for at least a generation. And you know that probably better than I do, because you keep up with the more current scholarship. I mean, when I started to read more current scholarship, there was a kind of culture shock to me because I was still living in the mid 20th century. And I thought everybody knows the French Revolution is important. And I think, by the way, that the question of the old narrative of the French Revolution, the perhaps somewhat vulgar class narrative, people like Soboul and so forth, I think it raises fundamental questions, by the way, about historical materialism. What does it mean to say the French Revolution is a bourgeois revolution, that it's the triumph of a class, right? That to me is a very fundamental question. A question, by the way, you can't really say about the American Revolution, right? The American Revolution wasn't getting rid of some feudal class or the coming to power of a bourgeoisie. I don't think you can really understand it as a bourgeois revolution in that sense. Though again, classically, Marxists have always understood it as a bourgeois revolution. But the French Revolution gives rise fundamentally to the very notion of a bourgeois revolution. For that reason alone, it is worthy of deep consideration.
Richard, I understand what you're saying there. And just though to here, there is a note of disagreement between us simply because I do think that the Soboul, that is, I think if you look at the evolution of left, whatever you want to call it, left historiography, because there are some in there who are Marxists and there are some in there who are socialists but not Marxists. But if you look at the evolution of the left historiography through someone like Soboul, I think there is a kind of class reductionism going on from classical Marxism. That is to say, I really do think there's a kind of Stalinistic, or Stalinist, I should say, sorry, class reductionism in the sense that ultimately, for classical Marxism, a bourgeois revolution is the political victory of bourgeois society over the obstacles to its continuing expansion and development. It's not simply the replacement of one class by another, the bourgeoisie replacing the, feudal aristocracy. My God, classical Marxists knew that there wasn't a feudal aristocracy in any real sense by the outbreaks of the English Revolution or the French Revolution in much of Western Europe. Okay, I'm sorry, but Richard, this is a long-standing debate between us. I really do think that classical Marxism has a perspective of the bourgeois revolution as the political consolidation of a bourgeois society that's been developing for a very long time. This is what I like to refer to as the shift from the revolution of society to the bourgeois revolution, the revolution for society. I don't think it merely had a conception of a replacement of one class by another. I think that's something that evolves in the historiography. And I think Soboul is therefore quite distant. The kind of Lefebvre-Soboul, I think, becomes one-dimensional and class reductionist, but I'm sure you disagree with that.
I do disagree. First of all, I don't think Lefebvre and Soboul can be united.
No, that's fair. Lefebvre is much less than Soboul.
But I also think that tradition and the problem raised by it goes back before Marxism. That narrative about what happened in the French Revolution goes back to the liberals of the Restoration, who saw the bourgeois revolution as also the rise of the bourgeoisie. And
but the liberals also saw it as a development of a new society, of the political victory of a new society.
They did, but I think that even in a lot of these people you see as class reductionists, there is the same awareness. But the difficult problem.
Can I say one thing, Richard, just for you? I actually reread a couple of years ago The Coming of the French Revolution by Lefebvre, and I think you're right. He has lines that are ultimately class reductionist, but it's clear to me from the book that he has that much wider kind of social and political imaginary of the political victory of a new form of society and not simply a class.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think now, like when people think Marxism is just economism and class reductionism.
Yes. Okay. I mean, I guess so. I don't know what people think Marxism is anymore. I think people think it's shrill liberalism.
We should probably, though, there are lingering questions.
There's another question. Is the counterposition of the two, or is it your self-avowed ambivalence about modernity, modernism? Well, I mean, I would say that in that respect, both the French Revolution and the American Revolution are harbingers of modernism. I mean, that I don't in that respect I don't counterpose them. I mean, I think that my skepticism is more about the notion of modernity as a kind of triumph of freedom. Like, to me, a lot of the Platypus narrative sounds like a bit of Whig triumphalism about the revolution continues and so forth. I mean, again, I'm emphasizing the French Revolution not because I see it as a success, but because I see it as a moment of crisis and failure that illuminates modernity. But nevertheless is a harbinger of modernity. I'm not identifying with the Jacobins as something pre-modern at all. And I'm not even suggesting that any such identification with pre-modernity makes any sense in our condition of hypermodernity.
Clay, are you still calling on people? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Ethan, you have your hand raised for a while.
Sorry. I kind of cut in on Kano's thunder a little bit here because I was thinking about when Jacobin was raised earlier. Of course, Jacobin magazine is named after the Black Jacobins, and insofar as the French Revolution is raised on the left today, it's usually either for its kind of superficial resemblance to 20th century Stalinism, or like, I don't know, like a positive um, affirmation of like the right wing caricature of like the relationship between the left and authoritarianism. So I really wanted to ask, like, uh, what about Haiti? What about kind of that episode of the unfolding of the French Revolution? And what do you make of the left's, insofar as it does take it up today? It's kind of affirmation of the French Revolution as apparently resembling like the necessities of 20th century Stalinism.
I'm not sure of whether I don't really see the resemblance to 20th century Stalinism. I mean, in retrospect, the Haitian Revolution can hardly be considered a glorious success. I mean, obviously, it was the offspring of the most radical aspects of the French Revolution. I'm not. I think that the focus on the Haitian Revolution by the contemporary left has less to do with its own development and more to do with race. I mean, basically, it's a way of seeing the revolution as something other than European.
This is true, Richard, but I also wanted to raise, I'm thinking about like Jacobin being founded in 2012, like it's specifically C.L.R. James. It's specifically the Black Jacobins, and like that is not just an affirmation of the Haitian Revolution as a straightforward success. Like Toussaint Louverture is kind of a tragic bourgeois figure. And I understand like that kind of falls out of the left today, but what do we make of the millennial left's relationship with the French Revolution? I guess it kind of self-paradizes into like the guillotine, but why does it
I mean,
come back?
does the millennial left have that much of a relationship to the French Revolution? I'm not sure. I mean, maybe that has to do with the same impulses to neo-Stalinism about, you can celebrate the French Revolution, but not Eurocentrically, because Haiti is a non-white, non-European country. I guess so. But in terms of like the political questions that I'm raising about Jacobinism, I mean, again, like I understand the title of C.L.R. James's book, The Black Jacobins, but it's a little misleading compare the social conditions and the meaning of Jacobinism in Haiti to contemporary France. I mean, it's not really the same. Jacobin in both contexts means something different. I mean, it means a radical politics in both cases. And, the Jacobins in France were anti-slavery, and obviously the Black Jacobins in Haiti were, but I don't think that that's the historical problem of Jacobinism that I've been talking about, which is basically focused on Europe. I'm not sure if that's an adequate answer.
I'll
You said there's a millennial return of the French Revolution, which I'm not really aware of.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of confused. I was really thinking of like Jacobin, and it is kind of like, yeah, it's confused and indirect, and it's through the Haitian Revolution, and maybe that's kind of just yeah, maybe that is just kind of like a racial move, but I don't know. I would like to think better of
But except for the name and the logo, I mean, Jacobin is basically a social democratic, left social democratic journal. Like, I mean, it has really nothing in common with historical Jacobinism in either France or Haiti.
I mean, regarding this, Richard, I mean, what would it mean for the millennials to like basically do the thing that every leftist had ever done and write a history of the French Revolution? I mean, do you think you could do something like that at this period in time? Like, I could really, for the millennials, I could really only imagine that amounting to like kind of ambivalently taking up like equality is the only positive takeaway from something like the French Revolution.
I mean, relatively recent history of historiography of the French Revolution, I mean, James can comment on it, on the whole tends to depress me. I don't know if any total histories of the revolution that have been written in the 21st century, let's say, that are particularly worth reading. There are various specialized studies. The better historiography seems to waver between a kind of revisionist dismissal and, I don't know, some harking after some of the better elements of the traditional kind of Marxist view. I don't know. James probably knows the historiography better than I do because I'm kind of isolated and stuck in the past. What do you think, James, about that?
No, I don't have anything substantial to add. I mean, I'm not, I have, very broad knowledge of the French Revolution. I'm not, somebody myself steeped in research on the French Revolution. But what I would say is that I think I would call it post-revisionist confusion. That is to say, broadly building on what Richard said, there was the dominance of revisionism. It began in the 50s and 60s, but really became dominant in the 80s and 90s. And I would say that the state of the historiography seems to me to be where no, the revisionists are wrong. We know that this isn't just all kind of contingent, accidental. To make a long story short, right, the revisionists were very much, again, like postmodernists, against meta narratives. They basically viewed the liberal and the Marxist accounts of the French Revolution as teleological and driven by grand narratives, meta narratives, etc. And they claimed to be these kind of very scientific and empirical historians who were going to disabuse us of these kind of grand narratives, etc. And I just have the sense of the French Revolutionary historiography today as being lost. And what I mean by that is people are deeply dissatisfied. People don't, in other words, they think that revisionism did successfully dismantle the grand narratives, the liberal and Marxist accounts, but failed to construct a kind of
anything in its place.
Exactly, Richard.
So
I think people, on one level, they know that the ossified liberal and Marxist interpretations of the mid 20th century were not just simply pushed; they were already falling. That they were unconvincing for a number of reasons, and now people basically they know that there's something there that's worthy of a grand narrative or meta narrative, but they don't even have the first clue as to where to begin. Sorry, Richard, you were going to say.
So I just to strengthen what James said, since we're in complete agreement here. I quoted James Livesey and the Making Democracy in the French Revolution, which is a pretty good book. But he's a perfect example of that he's a post-revisionist who can't accept the old Marxist narrative, but sort of wants to defend the Jacobins as sort of creating democracy. So intellectually, it's a kind of odd hodgepodge. Like it, and the other thing, he says something very curious in it, which is he says both the classical Marxist narrative and the revisionist operate according to a positivist epistemology. And I'm not sure that I agree with that or even understand it, but it's a curious kind of assertion. Yeah. So, I mean, so one question I'd have for James, though, is you speak about the ossified narratives, and we started to, I think, have an argument about Sobul. But like, I wonder how you would include a book that characterize a book that we both admire, like The Palmer. Like, is that type of Atlantic historiography also ossified? Like, what do you think about Cobbin? Like, are these narratives also outdated, or is there something in, if not the francophone Marxisant narrative of the French Revolution, is there something in the Atlantic history liberal narrative that is worth recovering?
Oh, sorry. I take your point, Richard. I think I spoke in a way that lent myself to the interpretation you're talking about. So I spoke poorly. Let me try and speak more clearly. In talking about the ossified liberal and Marxist interpretations, I had meant basically the kind of interpretive frameworks that were dominant, say, in the mid 20th century, the high 20th century. I didn't mean to suggest that liberal and Marxist narratives as a whole were unworthy. I just, let me put it this way. So, as Richard has already said, and which I agree, right? The bourgeois revolution idea is not something created by Marxism. It's actually created in the Enlightenment. It's created by Whigs. It's created by people who were Whigs, people who were liberals, people were radicals in the 18th. When Richard says that the classical account of the bourgeois revolution is not Marxist originally, but rather it's liberal and it's inherited by Marxists from liberals, I agree with that. But what he means by liberal there is, right, basically Enlightenment thinkers, Whigs, 18th century radicals, etc., developed this idea of the bourgeois revolution, which Marxism inherits and develops further. And I would say that when the original liberals were doing it and when the classical Marxists were doing it, it was this kind of account of a task. That is to say, human freedom is being advanced, and we have to figure out how it's being advanced. We have to figure out how we can contribute to it being advanced. And so I think that the liberal and Marxist historical interpretation was basically an attempt to clarify the conditions for how human freedom had developed and how it had been blocked and how those obstacles or blockages might be overcome and how human freedom might advance further. But I think by the mid 20th century, these perspectives had ossified into an academic historiography that was really a kind of, in the case of liberal historians, a kind of modernization theory. That is, they were no longer concerned with a project of advancing human freedom. They were basically concerned with understanding modern society and how you could maybe get the developing world to become more developed. It become a kind of modernization account. It was no longer a task, a project. Likewise, I think, a lot of the Marxist historiography had become a kind of settled Stalinism and a settled class reductionism and economism. So why do I say all of this? I do think that the liberal accounts and the Marxist accounts had ossified into modernization theory and into a kind of extremely class reduction, economistic, Stalinist approach. And so I think that they were already falling and the revisionists pushed them over. And that's what I meant. I did not mean to suggest that the original liberal and Marxist understanding of the bourgeois revolution, which I think Richard is right to see as continuous, right? I think that original understanding is absolutely worth recovering on its own terms. I was referring, Richard, if it makes sense, to the state of historiography, let's say in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Okay, I take that correction. James Calloway sent me a private message. Maybe he could read the question out loud.
Yeah, I just asked Richard, the Whig exceptionalist narrative, and the reason I had private messaged him is because it's not maybe pertaining directly so much to the French Revolution. But, he pointed to the Whig exceptionalist narrative of history that portrays modernity as a story of freedom, like as, one that, you say you worry about in Platypus, which funnily I feel associated by critics of ours, like that narrative is associated with Platypus's Trotskyism. And I say funnily because I think you, Richard, rightly or wrongly, I think of you as our most Trotskyist member. And so I don't know what you think of all that. Also, you mentioned CLR James, and I was reading him and Raya Duniskaya, like writing for the SWP minority, and one of their stated principles is against the theory of retrogression, right? So, yeah, whether that relates here, I don't know, but yeah, I just wondered what you thought of that.
So, I mean, yes, I see that people see me as the most Trotskyist member. I feel like what I feel called upon to defend in Trotskyism is the sense of an historical problem and a historical critique. So, just as I often feel that the American Revolution is privileged over the French Revolution, and the French Revolution is sometimes given short shrift, or is usually given short shrift, I tend to feel often that it's easier for our membership to digest the Frankfurt School part of Platypus and to put the Trotskyism in a kind of safe place and not necessarily think about it critically. So again, to the extent that I seem Trotskyist or I seem fixated on the French Revolution, it's because I feel they demand a critical response. Um, I'm not sure. Yeah, the Whiggism. I mean, obviously, my comment about James and me, like that, there's an element of that that's a joke. But I don't know. I'll have to think about it. But it was an interesting question. And I don't know the essay against the theory of retrogression. Obviously, both Platypus and I are defending theories of retrogression of some kind here.
Maybe let's make these the last two things. There was these questions from Tony Davies, and there was a question from Rebecca. I'll ask Tony's first because it's a little bit more straightforward, but I'll bundle these together even though they're different questions. Tony says that if there's time to discuss in more detail the tempo of the French Revolution in terms of why Richard thinks it's important to take it year by year. And I take it for that Tony's talking about when you were referring to 1792, 1793, 1794 earlier in the discussion. That would have been my question. Does this relate to its crisis? And how does this differ to other revolutions, which also lasted years? And Rebecca asked, to what extent is this a discussion of when does the left emerge? By this is meant, does the failure of the French Revolution give us more to learn contra the failure of the Bolshevik Revolution, as opposed to the success of the American Revolution being what underpins the success of the First and Second Internationals?
Okay, so the first question about the tempo of the French Revolution, I mean, it's just a fairly straightforward observation that a lot happened very quickly, and that you can't just speak about the French Revolution and say 1789, the way you could speak about the American Revolution and use 1776 as a shortcut. Yes, the American Revolution didn't happen in 1 year, but it doesn't politically change character radically from 1 year to another. Whereas the French Revolution, you speak about the days, the journée of the French Revolution, you know, uh, you know, June 2nd, 1793, and the expulsion of the Girondins from the convention, right? It's punctuated by a series of very discrete, significant political events that are often separated only by a few months or a year or whatever. And so the difference of a year, 2 years, or three is radically transformative, not only to external events, but to the political character of the revolution. Um, the question about Rebecca, I don't see the First and Second International as sustained by the American Revolution. Um, I do think there's a lot to be learned from the failure of the French Revolution insofar as that, or well, I would say not failure, but I would say crisis, because in a certain sense it doesn't fail. The crisis of the French Revolution does, I say, give birth to the modern left. I mean, the Bolshevik Revolution's crisis does not give birth to the modern left, except in a negative sense, in that the left already existed, and the Bolshevik Revolution and its crisis distorts the further history of the left. And we still live with the distortions induced by Stalinism, and they still haunt us. So it's a different, and again, I would reject the notion that either the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution simply failed. They went into crisis, they failed in terms of their true objectives, but they were not defeated by counter-revolution. And I wouldn't say the American Revolution failed. Like, all the critiques of the American Revolution are that it didn't that it didn't go far enough, right? That the Civil War was needed to finish the American Revolution. That's not what one would say about the French or Bolshevik Revolution. Is that helpful?
Hi, Richard. Thanks for responding. Um, yes, I think so. Well, because I was trying to think through the stakes of the discussion that's happening. And also, what I said about the American Revolution underpinning like the First and Second International, it's to this idea of maybe James's point of the constitution of a social revolution into a political one. Maybe to use these kind of ham-fisted categories, right? Whereas I guess with the stakes coming in on the French Revolution is
I
why
mean,
we're
yeah.
mhm.
I mean, the
Well,
First International, you could tie it to the Civil War,
yeah.
but I don't really see how you can tie it to the American Revolution. And the Second International
Well, when
was
you
not.
say like the Civil War, it was a continuation of the American Revolution. I guess that's what's in my head, right?
Oh,
It's
okay,
like
okay, sure. I
like
mean,
the American Revolution in the way that maybe like the Spartacus League would have called it the American Revolution in the 60s.
uh, okay. I mean, sure. You can see. Yes. Okay. Um, I mean, the other thing I would say about the Second International is it's not a response to any contemporary revolution, right? It develops out of the growth of the socialist movement. There is no kind of contemporary bourgeois revolutionary development or radicalization of bourgeois society that leads to the Second International. I mean, the Second International is founded on the centenary of Bastille, the taking of the Bastille, but that's an illusion. It's historical memory. It's not in any direct way a response to that. and it's already a kind of distant history. James Calloway says something about Korsh kind of say what Rebecca's saying about American Revolution enabling the First and Second International. I don't know.
I guess I think
Korsh.
again, kind of the deeper what I'm trying to think through here um, is this concept of bourgeois society, right? Which actually to go back to like revisionist history is completely thrown out the window. So the way that we perceive, or any kind of young historian would start to unpack these revolutions is not as a bourgeois revolution, but more as this contingent, historical event that various actors with competing interests manage to kind of like trudge through and enact, right? But my point being that the socialist imagination has like a claim on constituting bourgeois society. But then I think what's interesting about what you said, you feel compelled to talk about the French Revolution because of the failure of the Bolshevik Revolution, or that it was a failure, and maybe that speaks to us in some kind of way. And I wonder if kind of what we're getting at here is like, why has the left failed up to this point in time? Like, is it a intrinsic mechanism that we can kind of see the glimmers of in the French Revolution, and that's why it's worth going back to? Is that like that's how I'm kind of trying to understand what the whole point of this is, right? But I'm not sure if I'm right there. That's kind of why I'm
I
bringing
mean,
this up.
I'm not sure what the point of this conversation is. I mean, it was to have a kind of friendly intellectual conversation between me and James about the French Revolution on Bastille Day. The question of failure when you're talking about revolutions is complicated. And you know, if you ask, did the American and French Revolution succeed, you'd have to say yes to both. Because because certainly, obviously, the American Revolution succeeded by whatever standard you define success. It achieved its goals, it established a stable bourgeois social order, et cetera, created the greatest state in history, capitalist center of the capitalist world, etc. But the French Revolution also succeeded. I mean, in the long term, right? And this is where I brought up, when does the French Revolution end? By the 1870s, sometime to choose different dates, 1873 to 1870 something, France under the Third Republic achieved a stable bourgeois democratic rule based on universal male suffrage. Then women got the vote at the end of World War II. But that was the Jacobin goal. And that was achieved, right? It was achieved by a very conservative republic. It was not revolutionary when it was achieved because it couldn't address the real crisis of French society, which is capitalism, right? Both the United States and France now are successful capitalist bourgeois democratic republics. So in that sense, you can say these two revolutions succeeded. What I wanted to draw attention to about the French Revolution, right? And obviously the United States now is vastly more important than France, though at the time France was vastly more important than the United States. What I wanted to draw attention to was the crisis along the way of one of those two sister revolutions, the one we don't talk about as much in Platypus, and how that crisis itself leads into the modern left, and also how it raises so many questions about the future left, right? Like I know that Chris pushed back on the Bolsheviks identified with the Jacobins, and maybe I should have cited more chapter and verse of giving examples of all the ways that they clearly did. I don't think that that's just an error. I don't think that the Bolsheviks, sensing their connection to the Jacobins, their sense of repeating Jacobinism in the proletarian revolution, the way Jacobinism was to the bourgeois revolution, I don't think that that's just a façon de parler or a mistake. I think it says something deep and tragic about the history of the left.
Well, right. I think that's what I wanted to kind of put a finger on. I
Just
guess.
sorry, go ahead,
Mhm.
Rebecca.
No,
Go
go
ahead.
go go
No,
for
no,
it,
you go.
James.
You go. Go ahead.
Oh, well, no, no, it was I think that's kind of why I posed my question in the way that I did in terms of like what or what I was trying to kind of put my finger on was what is this deep and tragic impulse, kind of like recurrence in history that the Bolsheviks feel connected to, kind of like 110, 20 years later. Um, and I think that's how is that um, informing an assessment of the left today, or rather, how should Platypus think about the left?
Well, I think the left is still mostly haunted by the Bolshevik Revolution. I think however much one talks about the American Revolution or the French Revolution, positively or negatively, the real crisis for the left in thinking about revolution is the Bolshevik Revolution. It's the 20th century and Stalinism that really haunt us. Um, and I think that talking about the French Revolution often is a substitute for talking and thinking about the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, that can be true in good ways and bad ways. I mean, I think that, again, like here, I differing somewhat from my friend James, I am more sympathetic to a lot of that Marxism, even Stalinist historiography about the French Revolution. I think that it actually has some merit. Not that I swallow it wholesale, not that I don't resist it, um, and can't be completely dismissed. And I think that the the Bolshevik Revolution encouraged some excellent historiography in France, which doesn't mean that I just reject the Palmer or the liberal narrative either. I want my cake and eat it too.
I just wanted to say something very quickly about the stakes, which is I think that I want to reread a part. I read it already, but I think it's a really excellent point, really well put towards the end of Richard's speech. Forgive me for being repetitive. For as long as modernity, this is Richard, I'm quoting, for as long as modernity could be seen as pointing to socialism, the bourgeois revolutions could be seen as pointing towards socialism. With the decline of socialism, liberalism consumes itself, and historical memory becomes brittle and crumbles. I mean, that ultimately is the basis of historical revisionism. Modernity then indeed comes to seem a purely technical matter. Capitalism becomes seen as simply a nursery for technological innovation, and ideas of human freedom beyond capitalism seem impossible. I mean, I think there's kind of something awful to the fact that we still have to discuss the bourgeois revolutions. That is, one wishes that one lived in a world, obviously, where more practical questions of freedom beyond capitalism were being posed. But I think with the absence of that project, that is a really collective mass project for freedom beyond capitalism, I think what Richard says is happened. I think what Richard said is exactly what happened. Our historical memory, our historical consciousness has regressed, it's collapsed. And therefore, I just think it's a very important part of Platypus's educational activity to have to recover the classical liberal, the classical Marxist conception of the bourgeois revolution. I think fighting over things like, or not fighting, but really discussing, debating points about the American and French Revolution are vital in that sense. Uh, I think, let me just make this kind of a meta platypus point. I'm putting this extremely crudely. I think that the reason why I place such a strong emphasis on the American Revolution and am happy to accept what Richard says, guilty as charged. Because remember, Richard is not saying that Platypus is, or that I'm hostile to the French Revolution, but rather that there's a kind of, I forget the example he used, but a daughter you love more than another, right? I guess I just feel that the loss of any sense of liberalism, of that world historic emancipation that liberalism was bound up with, makes Marxism impossible. And therefore, maybe I over-egg the pudding a bit, to use a Britishism, on the American Revolution and on liberalism. And I think Richard is turning to this talk on the French Revolution because it is the case that for classical Marxism, the French Revolution was like a deeply problematic and mysterious in a broad sense, and they were grappling with it. And I think Richard's concern is we not just end in liberalism, right? There's some sense that something like Platypus might end simply in the recovery of liberalism and not, end in the possibilities for imagining new forms of freedom beyond it, beyond capitalism and beyond liberalism as what it is now. I mean, liberalism is now a legitimating ideology, obviously, of our world. I don't mean to deny that, but I think that's the grand stakes of this ultimately. I think there are fears here being manifested in, if I tend to overemphasize the American Revolution, of fears of a loss of a sense of this world historic emancipation of liberalism. I think Richard sees the importance of bringing the discussion of the French Revolution back in, not as an anti-American Revolution thing, but a yes and, which is, okay, but, we cannot just simply be satisfied with the defensive stance about liberalism, the American Revolution. I mean, Richard, I'm speaking for you here, but I think there is some fear.
I think that's very generous to me, and I'll happily accept that. I just want to say to people, most of whom I assume on this call are certainly younger than me, and I assume younger than you, that we are both old enough to remember and to mark the intellectual deterioration of the last, say, 25 years, right? There's been a marked disintegration of historical memory in our lifetimes, not over the whole span of bourgeois society, but really within the last generation. And it's at some level, it should be shocking, however much one gets accustomed to it. Would you agree?
Yeah, and by the way, I want to emphasize this. I mean, Richard said it in his talk, or implied it in his talk, but I mean, Richard is as completely and utterly horrified by contemporary progressive understandings of the American Revolution. None of this should be understood as Richard is in any way, shape, or form sympathetic to those whatsoever. I mean, when I relate to Richard the horrors of contemporary academic and progressive interpretation of the American Revolution, he's as horrified as I am. I think that's fair to say, Richard.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't live in that world.
Richard takes completely for granted, the idea that the New York Times 1619 Project is just obviously a nonsense. Like for Richard, that's just such completely nonsensical. It's not even worth talking about. But the problem is I inhabit a world where one has to talk about it. Yeah, I would love to be able to say with Richard, that is so obviously stupid. Let's not even discuss it. I just inhabit an everyday world where one has to discuss it and confront it all the time.
Right. So it's like you having to academically debate flat earthers.
Well put.
Okay.
We make Andrea the final question or comment.
Well, that's an incredible privilege. I'm sorry I was late today. Maybe I'll listen to the recording. But I'm older, I think, than both of you. I'm 63, and I had a terrible education. Thankfully, Platypus is helping with my education to some extent. I don't know earlier in your talk, I'd like to hear from both James and Richard. One of the things that I've loved so much about Platypus is not just studying the American or French Revolution, but really 1848 and 1871. Just this whole idea that, hey, all our wonderful dreams of emancipation and equality, but you know what? Without the socialist movement, it's insufficient. This is what happened in 1848. The bourgeois kind of regime paired with aristocratic monarchical legacies and turned against the workers. And so for me, maybe I'd like to hear you both talk about how, where, James, you prefer, your area of expertise is the American Revolution. For Richard, it's the French. Should should we really even look at either revolution without also reminding ourselves of both of their insufficiency and the horror that happened in 1848 and then the necessity of 1871 that preceded the need for the First and Second International? So there you go. That's my question.
Well, again, like 1848 seems to me like a straightforward story of revolutionary defeat. I mean, the classic Marxist narrative of 1848 is that the revolutionary bourgeoisie of the French Revolution had grown cowardly and feared the working class and abandoned the revolution. So the 1848 is the half-hearted, the failed revolution because of the bourgeoisie. I mean, I'm fine with accepting that narrative. I mean, 1871, I don't think is as central to the problem of history. I mean, the question about 1871 would be, is 1871 really the last gasp of an old phenomenon of a kind of Jacobin tradition, or is it a forerunner of the future? Is it really looking forward to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the Bolshevik Revolution and so forth? I tend to incline towards the backward-looking view of 1871. I think that the standard Leninist narrative of the commune as the forerunner of the dictatorship of the proletariat is anachronistic, but that's not that important. Um, I'm not I'm not sure. I mean, and as far as horror goes, like like the real horrors are in the 20th century. I mean, the 1848 was by 20th century standards like minimal amount of horror.
I don't have substantial to add to Richard or indeed Andrea to your comments, which or sorry, to your question, which almost can stand as a comment. I do subscribe, I guess, to the more traditional Leninist understanding of the commune. Maybe that's where Richard and I would disagree. But Andrea, I don't know, did you want to follow up on your comment or question?
No, I just that's lovely. Thank you. I can just say that just for myself personally, understanding that, that there was this ostensible task, this aim for the brotherhood of humanity, the equality and liberty of all, whether it be Haiti or the black slaves in America. But it just all kind of came crashing down in 1848 when we could see that, well, that there was some sort of problem with that, with the what is it, applying that kind of noble goal, and that the powers that be turned on the working class. They weren't, the working class wasn't able to assert its bourgeois rights. And therefore, the whole project of the bourgeois revolution is insufficient, again, without kind of pushing it forward with the task of socializing the means of production, so to speak. And so I just want to thank everyone for Platypus and for helping me understand that, and I'm sure many other people.
So I just had one comment on the commune. I mean, the Bolsheviks loved the commune, and there were still some communards alive at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution who could serve as a link between the two revolutions. I think that the commune served as two things, basically, in the history of Marxism: a kind of criticism of contemporary conservative trends, and later on for the Bolsheviks, a kind of heroic predecessor, right? The commune lasted for such a short amount of time and was limited to one city that ultimately people could project back onto it whatever they wanted. And it was the idea of the commune. I mean, the commune is one of the great revolutionary myths, and that's valid. But it, to me, does not raise the theoretical questions that are raised by, say, the Jacobin moment or the American or any of the classic bourgeois revolutions, because it was just a couple of months in one city.
Just Clay, can I say one thing before?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I just put an image in the chat. I realize people won't be able to see it unless you're here in the chat, but I'll just say, sorry, just a very minor note to end on. It's an image of the key to the Bastille prison, right? We are, after all, having this conversation today because it's Bastille Day, right? It's July 14th. And Richard explained, obviously, for those who were not familiar with it, what was entailed in the storming and the tearing down of the Bastille prison in Paris. Most famously, a year after that takes place in 1790, the Marquis de Lafayette gives the key that is the main key. So the image I put in the chat is the actual key to the main door of the Bastille prison, which the Marquis de Lafayette gives to George Washington in 1790 as a gift. And so if you want to see this great remnant of the Bastille prison, you have to travel not to Paris or to France. You have to travel to Mount Vernon, Virginia, on the Potomac, just outside of DC, and go into George Washington's main house at Mount Vernon. And you can see in the main room that they have preserved that key exactly where George Washington had, in the most prominent placement possible. I'm emphasizing this, guys, only because I know it's tired and boring to say, but ultimately the American and French Revolution are one. They're inseparable. Yes, there are differences between them, but ultimately the aspirations and animating impulses and aims are of a common pattern of they are one. And I think it's important to remember that. So the Bastille, if you want to go see it, is at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Richard, why don't you close this out? Give us your final comment.
Well, I don't really have any final comments that I can think of. You could go see the key in Mount Vernon, and the neighborhood around the Bastille, there are lots of bars and nightclubs. At least that was my memory. That's not a heroic comment. I mean, there was one question about platypus internal education. What would I suggest? I don't know. It's difficult. I've been negligent. I made promises that I haven't been able to keep. Maybe you can write me later and I'll think of a better answer.
Richard is preparing the 250th. He's preparing a 250th anniversary lecture series on the French Revolution.
Yeah, I hope it's a little earlier than that, but probably by then I'll have it ready. Well, I hope this amused you guys.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, James.
Thank
You were
you,
a very
Jake.
good interlocutor.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Richard.